Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 42 to 60. Chapter 42 Death of a Marshal. Lord Friedhelm von Thierse had served as the Marshal of Kufstein for close to 30 years now. He was a man who was growing older in his years and now had long white hair, a matching beard, and many wrinkles. Despite his old age, the elderly man could still wield a sword in combat and command his liege's armies in battle. That is until a week ago, when his health took a sudden turn for the worse. His physicians did not know the cause of his illness and attributed it to the frailty of old age. However, today, the same day that Lind announced she was pregnant, the elderly man was lying on his deathbed in his family's domain, in which they had ruled under the fealty of the von Kufsteins for centuries. His children were surrounding him and awaiting his last gasp. Truthfully, the man had lived long enough to know when someone was poisoned, and he already had a suspect in mind. However, by the time he realized this fact, it was too late, as he was now too frail to communicate his suspicions effectively. Currently, his servants attended to his need. However, he was now certain that they were secretly agents of Berengar and had been the ones to administer the poison to him in the first place. At the moment, a servant who had been in his service for the past 15 years approached him and force-fed the old lord a glass of water which was laced with poison. Since the marshal was no longer able to drink without assistance, he had no choice but to accept the final dose of the lethal poison. It took a while for the dose of poison to take effect. As such, the elderly lord struggled desperately to make his last words an accusation against the eldest son and heir of the Baron. Ultimately, the sounds that came out of the elderly lord's mouth could not manage to contain a coherent thought. The only understandable word in his deathly babble was the word, Lambert, which immediately caused a hint of concern on his family's faces. Why would the old man's last word be the name of the second son of the Baron? However, before they could ask the old man what he meant by using the name, the marshal drew his last breath and exited this world. Ultimately, this left a hint of suspicion on several of the more clever family members' faces. They would even investigate if Lambert had something to do with the old patriarch's sudden illness. Ironically, by trying to get his family to warn Lambert that his brother was the most likely suspect with the marshal's untimely death, Lord Friedhelm instead thrust the suspicion onto Lambert, which would ultimately result in his family siding with Berengar in the war for the title of Baron. Of course, at the time, Berengar had no way of knowing that his assassination of the marshal would provide key evidence in his later attempts to eliminate Lambert as a threat. Thus, on that night, the lordship of Thierse mourned the loss of the mighty and efficient lord who had presided over them for decades. By the time Berengar and his family heard the news of Lord Friedhelm's passing, it was already late into the next day. This was shocking news for Sigurd, who suspected his marshal to be having a brief bout of illness. He had never expected the elderly lord to die from what ailed him. As such, Sigurd immediately called for a grand funeral to honor the memory of his loyal marshal, who had served his family for so many years. On the other hand, Lambert was horrified by the news. He had only recently become aware of his ally's illness and chalked it up to the troubles of the elderly. However, with his passing and Berengar's smug expression, he knew instantly that his brother had conspired against a key ally in his fight for the inheritance. Without the marshal on his side, he would have difficulty rallying the town guard against Berengar when his father eventually departed for war. Even if Lambert did not truly understand how efficient Berengar's militia was, if Lambert acted quickly enough upon their father's departure, he could seize power and imprison his brother before Berengar's militia could enter the castle's gates and secure the young lord's regency, which had been a critical point in Lambert's plans for the future. Without the forces already stationed in the castle backing him, Lambert now had little chance of achieving such aims. Nor could he form his own militia, as Berengar clearly had won the hearts of the common folk, and rumors had spread around of Lambert's character being more wicked than he displayed in public. In fact, despite the period of mourning, Sigurd needed to declare a new marshal. The only problem was there were not many men as experienced as Friedhelm in the ways of war. The position of marshal was critical for a lord, as they essentially commanded all forces of the realm in the stead of the feudal lord. However, Sigurd personally enjoyed commanding his forces. Under his reign, the marshal had always been more of an advisor on strategy and tactics, as well as the chief of his law enforcement. As Sigurd was not expecting to survive the upcoming war, he had to consider someone capable of advising his son and heir on the matters of law enforcement and warfare in the future. What Sigurd did not know is that Berengar had already found such a capable man to fulfill the role and would eventually replace whoever Sigurd had chosen for the position of Marshal. Currently, Sigurd was in a meeting with Berengar discussing the role of Marshal and who should be appointed. Berengar was surprised that Sigurd was now taking his opinion into account. It could only mean one thing: Sigurd was preparing for his eventual death on the battlefield and his son and heir's transition to power. However, he had to confirm such suspicions and thus asked his father outright. "Father, I know that there is a storm approaching and that soon this land will be embroiled in civil war. Are you not planning to take your marshal with you into battle?" Sigurd gazed solemnly upon his son and heir. He had a suspicion that Berengar's act of forming a militia was to act as a proper defense for the barony while he was away at war, which was one of the reasons he would always compromise when it came to the expenses of arming the militia. "I won't lie to you, son, what you say is true. Shortly, I will be called to war by the Count of Tyrol. I do not anticipate coming back from this conflict alive. It may take years, but sooner or later, I will perish on the battlefield fulfilling my duties to our liege. What I want is to put someone capable in charge of barony's defenses and law enforcement. Someone who can guide you best on how to defend our land in my stead." Berengar tried not to smile as his suspicions were confirmed. His father knew he was no longer fit to be Baron with how efficient Berengar had proven himself as a ruler. Now that his children were old enough to survive without him, he was looking for a way out. This meant that in a handful of years, Berengar would be Baron and could fully enact his plans to conquer the German-speaking regions. Rather than waiting for his father to die peacefully in his sleep in a few decades. Berengar was ruthless to his enemies, perhaps even cruel, but he was not a psychopath. His father had shown him nothing but benevolence and patience as he grew up, and Berengar had no desire to harm his father to accomplish his goals. At most, he would have mustered his forces and force his father to abdicate if his reign went on for too long. With his father's goal to assign a marshal who can aid Berengar, he had no choice to voice the candidate he already had in mind. "Father, I know of a man who is perhaps greater material for a marshal than the late Friedhelm." Sigurd looked up from his list of candidates and stared into Berengar's eyes. He was personally not aware of such a man in his realm. "You do?" Berengar nodded as he proceeded to make his suggestion. "Eckhard, he is an anointed knight and a veteran of many battles. He has quite the mind for strategy and tactics, and I'm certain he can quickly adapt to the role of law enforcement. He's the second command of my militia and was instrumental in the defeat of Ulrich's forces at Mining Town." A wide smile spread across Sigurd's face. It turned out his son had already found a capable marshal who was loyal to him. This was good news for the realm's future. As he thought about it, he began to smile more. This essentially meant that Berengar's militia could be incorporated into the town guard and act as a military force, with police duties among the civilians. In Berengar's previous world, such a force would be referred to as gendarmerie. It would be quite the efficient force in defending his family's territory when he was off at war. As such, he immediately accepted Berengar's suggestion. "Very well, I will name Eckhard Marshal of the realm after Friedhelm's funeral. We will incorporate your militia into the town guard, and it will act as the defensive force of the barony and as its law enforcement." Berengar was extremely delighted by this news. By eliminating Friedhelm, he had guaranteed that a unit of his forces would be stationed in the castle and loyal to him. If Lambert attempted to cause trouble upon the start of his regency, it would not end well for his little brother. With a single assassination, Berengar had greatly weakened Lambert and his allies' ability to harm him. Slowly but surely, the tides were turning in his favor. Soon he would be able to finish this war of intrigue and secure his reign. With Eckhard's appointment as marshal, he could root out any supporters of Lambert within the ranks of the town guard and have them expelled from its forces under false charges, thus ensuring the only armed force within the Barony of Kufstein after Sigurd's departure was loyal only to Berengar. This also would mean that Berengar would now have the authority to raise cavalry forces and add them to his ranks, albeit in small numbers. He believed he would start with a unit of demi-lancers, a type of cavalry that would one day replace the heavily armored knights of this era. The establishment of such a force would have to wait until after Eckhard's appointment to marshal, which would take at most a month and a minimum of a fortnight. Nevertheless, things were looking bright for Berengar's future as his path to power was slowly beginning to come together. After conversing with his father about the details of the appointment for some time, Berengar returned to his room, where he began drafting the plans for the establishment of a demi-lancer company, which would be outfitted with 3/4 munitions-grade plate armor and lances. After a while, he heard a knock on his door, and when he opened it, he saw Adela standing before him in a beautiful dress in the colors of black, white, and gold, which were the colors of his house. She looked ravishing in such attire. In her hands was a tray full of cookies and milk. The young girl had quite the sweet tooth. "May I enter?" Berengar would not deny his future wife entry into his room. As such, he made way for her approach, and the two sat down next to each other while snacking on the treats. Though Berengar enjoyed them, he did not enjoy the sweet desserts quite as much as Adela did. Still, he could not prevent his mind from thinking about chocolate. Unfortunately, it would be a long time before he could send an expeditionary force to the Americas to claim potatoes and cocoa. Nevertheless, it was one of his greatest goals in this life. The establishment of a colonial empire in his mind was a necessity. However, the reasoning was more for the wide variety of crops and spices it could bring back and less for the territorial expansion. Nevertheless, when he was able to do so, he fully intended to take advantage of the European powers' lack of knowledge of the rest of the world and lay claim to territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. With the power his armies would wield by then, nobody could stop him. To achieve this, he would first need to unite Germany and gain some coastal territories. He wanted major naval bases in the Baltic, North, and Adriatic seas. Then he would need to build a mighty navy to maintain colonial power. Either way, it was many years, if not decades, away from where he currently stood. Nevertheless, he would do everything he could to establish his empire as the world's preeminent power. Needless to say, there was a lot of work ahead of the ambitious young lord. For now, he relaxed by his young fiancée and dined on cookies while dreaming of conquering the world. Chapter 43: Expanding Influence. While Berengar was conversing with Adela and going over his drafts for establishing a demi-lancer company, Lind was hard at work as the master of Berengar's intricate spy network. What started as a small group of peasants watching and listening to potential threats and reporting them to Berengar turned into a massive spiderweb that infiltrated every noble house within the Barony of Kufstein under Linda's management. Say what you want against Berengar's lover, but she had a brain for intrigue and had been crucial in the war against Lambert and his allies. The beautiful young woman divided the network into various cells located in every major inhabited region of the barony. Through combined use of couriers, carrier pigeons, direct interaction, smoke signals, and other methods of communication, Lind was able to understand everything that was transpiring within the region of Kufstein. A complex hierarchy was established to allow the freedom of local cells to engage in espionage, propaganda, and assassination at will, without it ever being traced back to Berengar's doorstep. The hierarchy was as follows. At the top of the organization was Berengar. He was referred to by those who knew of his existence as the sovereign. Beneath the sovereign was the listener. This was Linda's job. She would listen to Berengar's orders, if he had any, and relay them to the speakers, who were the leaders of every cell. The speakers would then relay these jobs to the eyes, ears, mouths, and hands. Each was tasked with a different specialty in intrigue. Eyes and ears were generally used for espionage and gathering intelligence. Mouths were used to disseminate misinformation and engage in propaganda efforts, and the hands were used for practical jobs, primarily being assassination and sabotage. Below all of these were associates. They were not official members of the organization but were essentially pawns who unwittingly aided Berengar's spy network. The only members who knew that Berengar was the sovereign were the listener and the speakers. The rest were merely led to believe they were acting in the interest of the realm, and as such, if caught and interrogated, could not pin the blame on Berengar. Currently, Lind was expanding the network throughout the entirety of Tyrol, starting with establishing a cell within Innsbruck. She knew just the person to fill the speaker's position, someone who could be trusted and was completely loyal to her. When she wrote the letter to her personal maid informing her of the duties she would be responsible for, the young woman took extra precaution and wrote the letter in a code that only the two would understand. Linda's maid was actually her little half-sister, a bastard of the family, and her name was Adelheid. If anything, Adelheid was the closest thing Lind had to a friend growing up. After all, Linda's cold, sadistic, and domineering attitude had kept many people away from her. Those who stuck around were generally guys entranced by her physical beauty, like Lambert. Unfortunately for them, they were never able to win her favor. Thus Lind wrote the letter honestly to Adelheid, informing her of everything she had been through in Kufstein and her change in character. The only reason she risked doing so is that she knew Adelheid would support her no matter what she did or who she became. The letter contained some deeply personal information, including that she was currently pregnant with Berengar's child and had framed Lambert into being perceived as the father. After writing about past events, she concluded the letter asking for Adelheid's help forming a spy network throughout Innsbruck. There was sufficient pay offered, which was obviously kept off the ledgers, but more importantly, it was a personal request from Adelheid's big sister and best friend. After sending the letter with a confidant to her home in Innsbruck, Lind sat back and sighed as she drank from a glass of purified water in which Berengar had made sure to make plenty of for her consumption. After all, she could not drink alcohol during her pregnancy, and Berengar would never allow her to drink unfiltered water. Lind rubbed her belly as she thought about the child growing inside of her. Every day she prayed it was a son so that he could inherit Berengar's position one day. Having full confidence that he would become a king, she wanted her son to be legitimized and succeed his father more than anything. Of course, if she knew that Berengar had already planned a wide degree of political reforms for the future, one of which was critical to succession laws, then she would not care so much about whether or not her first child is a boy. She figured that Berengar was in his room eating snacks with Adela and talking about his plans right now. She scoffed at the little girl's sweet tooth and figured that one day it would come back to bite her. Nevertheless, she wished it was her with Berengar right now. However, she could not very well intrude on their private time. After all, she would have plenty of it for herself later, and though she was competing with Adela for Berengar's affection, she had no plans to monopolize him for herself. She had become quite accepting of her role as his lover. In the meantime, she was trying on dresses that Berengar had made for her. They were all in the colors of his house, which she took as a sign that he truly thought of her as family. If anyone asked where she acquired them from, she would say she purchased them from Berengar. Nobody needed to know that the Baron's son and heir showered her with gifts, everything from fine jewelry to exquisite dresses and shoes. Berengar made sure that both his girls were basking the most luxurious of clothing and accessories available. She looked in the mirror gauging her appearance and knew that Berengar would be delighted by her stunning beauty. She could not wait to show him how she appeared in the attire he had made for her. However, that would have to wait. For now, she passed the time mixing and matching her outfits and accessories until she found the perfect looks for each of them. Berengar was sitting in his room eating snacks with Adela. For whatever reason, the young girl decided to feed him the treats herself. He found the idea to be a bit ridiculous, but thankfully nobody was nearby to see the embarrassing scene. As such, he closed his sapphire eyes and accepted the treats his young fiancée fed him. For some reason, he could not help but feel like he had reached the pinnacle of life at this moment. Of course, a moment later, he quickly realized such a thought was absurd, and his fiery ambitions took hold of his mind once more. Nevertheless, he enjoyed the time spent with Adela. Eventually, he had to stop the girl's actions. Unlike her, he could not eat so many sweets without feeling sick to his stomach. Adela pouted after seeing him resist the treats she was trying to force feed him, but eventually, she accepted that he was too old to eat nothing but dessert. Berengar, on the other hand, finally had to express his concerns about the young girl's eating habits. You know it is terrible for your health if you continue eating such a large amount of sweets as you do. You should really eat more meat and grains. Once more, the adolescent girl began to pout as she heard his words. The expression on her face was too cute. Berengar could not help but tease her. What if I fed it to you? Would you eat some then? Adela could not help but become flustered by his statement as her cheeks became as red as apples. Eventually, she nodded, and Berengar could not stop himself from chuckling. Wait, right here. I will go get some of my favorite foods, and we will share them, okay? It was not as if Adela did not like the myriad of recipes Berengar had introduced to the world. She preferred the desserts, which as a responsible adult, Berengar could no longer allow her to snack upon them constantly throughout the day. As such, he walked to the kitchen, where he found the chefs hard at work. Upon seeing the young lord approach, they all greeted him. My lord, what brings you to the kitchen? Berengar smiled at the cooks as he saw their eager expressions. He came here with a purpose in mind and soon expressed it. Do you guys have any pork rolladen lying around that I can snack on? A particularly young chef walked over with a plate filled with the fabled dish and brought it to him. I had just finished cooking this, it would be an honor for you to taste it. Berengar smiled, took a juicy piece from the plate, and stuffed it in his mouth, a wide grin spreading across his face. Excellent, it has turned out great. Do you mind if I take the whole plate from you? The cook shook his head with an eager smile on his face. Not at all, my lord, all of this belongs to you and your family. Berengar quickly accepted the plate. The only other thing he stopped by for was a flagon of beer to wash it down with. Afterward, he walked off toward his personal room after leaving behind a message. You guys are doing an excellent job, keep up the good work. With that, he disappeared into the hallway while the cooks looked at him with excited expressions. They were just complimented by the man who came up with all these recipes. Clearly, they were doing their jobs correctly. Berengar returned to his quarters with a plate full of pork roulade and a flagon of beer in his hands. He proceeded to sit down next to Adela as he picked up a piece with his finger and stuffed it into the little girl's face. Say ah. Adela's face became flushed with embarrassment, but eventually, she closed her eyes and did as she was told. Ah. Eventually, the food entered her mouth, and she could not help but exclaim in excitement. It was so much tastier when being fed to her by the man she loved. Eventually, she devoured the whole thing, and before she knew it, Berengar said something to her, which she didn't register because he had moved too quickly. You have something on your face, silly girl. With that said, Berengar reached out with his index finger and wiped the excess sauce off the roulade off her pretty pink lips, and stuck it into his own mouth. After licking his finger for a few moments, one word escaped his lips. Tasty. Afterward, he began snacking on a piece himself while Adela nearly passed out from embarrassment. Berengar could not help but laugh at her sheepish expression. He decided to tease her a bit more. You want more? Despite her awkwardness, Adela nodded her head while her face was practically the color of a tomato. As such, Berengar repeated the process with the girl, after which she asked him a question that shocked him. Is that beer? Berengar could not help but nod his head. He was quite proud of the beer produced by the village and practically drank it full time. With his alcohol tolerance, he did not need water. Besides, he needed the calories since he was still trying to bulk up. He eventually asked her the question on his mind. Why do you ask? Adela shifted her eyes left and right before speaking her thoughts. Can I have some? Berengar was in a moral dilemma, though it was common for children to drink in this time period, as there was no drinking age. Berengar could not help but have a nagging voice in the back of his head from his 21st century memories telling him it was illegal to supply minors with alcohol. However, his medieval mindset eventually won the debate, and he extended the flagon for Adela to drink from. After taking a large gulp of the beer, the more the girl drank, the more her face began to become red with intoxication. She was not used to consuming alcohol, and thus rapidly became drunk. Eventually, Berengar cut her off, but by that point, her small head had begun to bob as she rested it on Berengar's shoulder. Eventually, she looked up at him with a drunken gaze filled with desire and pressed her lips against his, which startled the young lord. Though it was another childish peck on the lips, the expression on her face led Berengar to believe that he had allowed her to drink too much. Thus he retreated from her grasp. The moment he did so, tears began to form in the adolescent girl's eyes as she asked the question which concerned her. Do you not like me? She stated in her drunken state. Berengar sat next to her and hugged Adela tightly as he calmed her down. It is not like that, you are just too young right now. In a few years when we are married, I promise we can spend more time together. But for now, I think you should get some sleep. As such, despite the girl's intoxicated protests, Berengar picked Adela up into a princess carry and dragged her off to her room. After placing her in her bed, the girl quickly passed out, and Berengar could not help but think to himself as he looked upon Adela, who was sprawled out on her bed in a drunken stupor. This girl is too cute. With that being said, he left Adela's room and returned to his own, where he got back to work on his plans for the demi-lancer equipment and tactics. Before long, he heard a knock on his door, and he could already guess who it was. When he finally opened the door, he saw Lind wearing one of the many dresses he gave her. She was adorned with the lavish jewelry he gifted her and wore a pair of black leather slippers. She looked at him with a slightly flustered expression and asked him the question that had been on her mind for the last hour and a half. How do I look? Berengar could not help but smile as he pulled her into his arms, shut the door, and kissed her passionately. After over a minute of making out, Berengar broke away and gave her the answer she was hoping for. "You're the most beautiful woman I have ever met in my life." Her heart nearly jumped out of her chest from the compliment her lover had given her. Berengar was honest when he said that, in the entirety of his 2 lives, the only woman he had ever met who came close to her natural beauty was Adela, and she was still a child. Maybe one day she could rival Lind, but for now, the young woman before him was the only woman on his mind. After spending an ungodly amount of time undressing Lind, Berengar finally got her onto his bed, where the two spent the night together, enjoying each other's warm embrace. Despite being already pregnant, Berengar tried his best to give her another child that night. After a night filled with passionate lovemaking, the two finally fell asleep early in the morning. It would not be for several hours before they awoke once more and began their daily routines. Chapter 44 Checking in on things. Berengar was currently in a sparring session with Eckhard with wooden swords. It had been quite some time since Berengar had first picked up the sword and had incorporated its training into his weekly exercise routine. By now, he was starting to become competent in swordsmanship, at least from a fundamental level. Though Berengar still vastly preferred the use of a bayonet, he felt it was still necessary for him to master the fundamentals of swordsmanship. You never know when you might be forced to wield a sword in combat. Eckhard cut down with a vertical slash towards Berengar. The young lord quickly parried the blow before swiftly counter-attacking. Ultimately, this action was dodged by Eckhard, who unleashed a flurry of blows that Berengar struggled to keep up with. After a few moments of intense sword fighting, Berengar was tripped to the ground, and Eckhard pointed his sword at the young lord's vitals. Berengar was at a loss and yielded to his opponent. "Damn it, I yield once more." Eckhard chuckled as he stripped off his training gear and assisted Berniger up from the ground. After the two stashed away their equipment, they headed to the kitchen, where Berengar procured a liter of beer for each of the men. As a man of refined tastes from his previous life, Berengar was extremely dissatisfied with the quality of alcohol in this world. Aside from distilling alcohol for medical practices, he had recently begun distilling spirits for regular consumption. In fact, he had recently obtained a plot of land from his father to make a large and dedicated brewery with the intent to mass-produce a variety of beers and spirits. The fact that his favorite beers being Doppelbock and Oktoberfest did not exist yet in this world was a damn shame. Unfortunately, it would take him at least a year to brew the first batch of Doppelbock and close to it for Oktoberfest. Thus, for now, he regularly consumed light beer, which was common in this world. It was hard to enjoy his favorite meals to the fullest extent without his most treasured alcoholic beverages and the missing dishes that utilized chocolate or potatoes. Still, it was acceptable for now. He just feared that he would have to wait many years before he could once more taste some of his most favored cuisine that was sadly absent from his meals. After sharing a drink, the two men walked down to the training field, where they quickly got dressed in their combat attire and began to lead the troops for combat drills personally. Berengar commonly carried a flintlock musket, pistol, and a side sword. If he lost the use of his primary weapon for whatever reason, he wanted a backup in case he was in immediate danger. Berengar's kit was relatively unique. He had a black leather bandolier that held 2 flintlock pistols and a sword belt that contained a simple side sword. It was not the elegant sword that would later be his wedding gift from Ludwig and his workers. Instead, it was a rudimentary design that worked as an additional sidearm. His belt also contained the cartridge pouch which held his paper cartridges for the musket. When you took into account his extra garish attire, he easily stood out from the other soldiers in his army, which was both good and bad. It made it easier for his troops to understand where their commander was, but it also made him a more noticeable target to his enemies. Nevertheless, the young lord stood by his troops and conducted firing practice with them. By now, the earliest troops had graduated basic training and were going through specialized training. The training field was constructed with makeshift buildings and barriers acting as a simulated village for when they were in urban combat. The grenadier would clear buildings by lobbing their grenades inside and waiting for the blast before storming in with their muskets loaded and ready with bayonets affixed. Berengar did not care about civilian casualties in a war zone. He only cared about how efficiently his army could handle the task with minimal casualties on his own side. As such, the tactics he used would be deemed excessive and possibly even war crimes in his past life. However, There were no such things in this feudal era, and he was free to conduct warfare as he saw fit. Line tactics, anti-cavalry tactics, urban warfare tactics, siege tactics, these were all things he wanted his men well accustomed to. The peaceful days he had lived in were quickly coming to an end, though Berengar had not received any recent updates on the king's status. It would not be long before the German-speaking regions found themselves embroiled in a bloody conflict for the succession of the title. It was even quite possible that the war could spread to the other regions of the Holy Roman Empire. Nevertheless, to an ambitious young man like Berengar, this war was an opportunity to seize power. When all was said and done and the war was over, the feudal powers of the German regions would be weakened, and he would have the opportunity to rise like an eagle. As such, the young lord had a cruel smile on his face as he watched his men perform the tasks he required of them with ease. Soon a new era would rise, an era of steel and shot, an era of industry. After a long day of arduous training, Berengar returned to the village where he visited Gunther, who was overseeing his agricultural implementations. When he visited the man's farm, he saw that all of his advancements had been implemented and that Gunther's farm, in particular, was extraordinarily prosperous. With the introduction of animal-powered mechanization, the nearby farmlands were incorporated under his supervision as their previous workers began to shift to the industrial workforce. So many families working one plot of land was no longer necessary. Though these tools had not yet been mass-produced nor had they been outfitted to all of the farms across the village of Kufstein, the fact that Gunther and his large family alone were able to take care of such a large farm was a good sign of the future. When Gunther noticed Berengar's approach, he immediately stood at attention and smiled as he addressed the young lord. "My lord, the harvest this year is sure to be bountiful. The livestock is also growing in numbers now that they can be bred year-round." Berengar clasped the man on the shoulder as he greeted him. It had been some time since he checked up on his progress in person. "It is good to see you, old friend. That is excellent news." Gunther smiled and accepted Berengar's greeting. "So what can I help you with, my lord?" Berengar smiled and began to walk around the farm, inspecting its progress in person while Gunther followed behind him. "Tell me, how is the implementation of the four-field system, phosphate fertilizer, and irrigation going across the barony's many farmlands?" Gunther kept track of the progress throughout the town, and word eventually spread from contact with the other townships and villages within the barony to Gunther. "As far as I know, your innovations are fully implemented here in the town of Kufstein. In the other regions, we have seen the four-field system and fertilizer being used. Though irrigation is on the rise, it will still be a few months before it is used across the board. Many of the unemployed farmers of the other regions are flocking to the town of Kufstein looking for work. As far as I'm aware, they fit in well with locals. Soon enough, this town may become a real city." Berengar smiled upon hearing such news. Clearly, construction was undergoing, and the city development plan he had petitioned his father to use was currently going underway. Before long, a new city would appear here in the heart of Kufstein. Berengar had many plans underway to reduce squalor and homelessness. Keeping the city organized was a top priority. "That is exactly what I wanted to hear. Now tell me, Gunther, when will we see the new machines implemented into agriculture across the town?" Gunther smiled and shared the good news with Berengar. "Roughly 3 months, my lord, and the town's agriculture will be mechanized as you put it. Maybe a year later, the rest of the barony will follow suit." Berengar was pleased with this news. Hopefully, his barony would have mechanized agriculture powered by animals by the time the war broke out. If not, at least it would be close to it. He could not be happier with the way things were headed. After speaking with Gunther for a bit about what he had been up to since Berengar's last visit, the two parted ways for the day. Berengar still had to check up on Ludwig in the industrial sector. After returning to the industrial sector, it was a completely different sight from when he was last there. He now had 2 steel production lines, an arms factory, an armory, an agricultural equipment factory, and a textile factory. The industrial sector was bustling with hundreds if not thousands of workers who were hard at work producing the products needed to usher in the new age. The machinery used to produce equipment was all water-powered. Wherever necessary, assembly lines were in place to make the creation process smoother. As such, it was quite the operation. Berengar figured there was no city on the planet with such an advanced industrial sector. The best part is that it was growing by the day. When Berengar approached Ludwig's old shop, which was now his office, he saw the older man was hard at work looking at a set of blueprints Berengar had given him. The office was completely cluttered with designs, and paperwork was strewn about. Berengar knew the pains of paperwork all too well. After all, he had his nights filled with it. As such, he could empathize with the old man who was so hard at work that he did not notice Berengar's entry. It was not until Berengar cleared his throat that the man noticed the young lord standing in front of him. "My lord, I am sorry I did not see you there," Ludwig said as he rapidly rose to his feet. However, Berengar quickly signaled that he could sit down, and as such, Ludwig was only halfway out of his seat before he sat back down in his old leather chair. "What brings you here, my lord?" Berengar chuckled and looked over the paperwork Ludwig was currently going over before speaking his thoughts. "I am just checking in on things. How are you holding up?" Ludwig let out a deep sigh and vented his frustrations to the young lord who he knew would take it in stride. "I am fine, just a little overworked is all, though I am sure you are the same way. Of course, I do not have a beautiful young lover to vent all my frustrations on at the end of every night." Berengar could not help but laugh at the old man's comments. It was true he released any pent-up emotions through his nightly escapades with Lind, and as such, always woke up refreshed. The same could not be said for everyone else. "So, how is it going with my factories?" Ludwig quickly smiled with a hint of pride on his face. His hard work was paying off. "What was the saying you used before? Everything is running like a well-oiled machine?" Berengar chuckled when he heard that phrase. It was definitely out of place in this medieval world. Still, he had been known to use idioms from his past life, which had caused confusion on several occasions. "That is good to hear. I see a lot of men working here. Are they properly paid and given the necessary rest breaks?" Ludwig nodded with a big grin on his face as he answered Berengar's question. "Of course, and they're quite thankful for it. Many of the new arrivals are men from the other regions of the barony, and they had expected to have been slaved to death here in the factories, like many of the miners used to be before you began to impose your reforms on the realm. Despite the hard work, they are quite happy about their pay and hours, for the most part. Unfortunately, there will always be a few bastards complaining about their life no matter how good they have it." Berengar nodded at Ludwig's words. He spoke the truth. You could not please everyone in this world, but at least they were afforded a proper wage, working hours, and safety standards, which is more than could be said about the rest of the world at the moment. The exponential growth of his family's wealth from all of the business he had made over the past few months has allowed him to increase the workers' wages and set up performance bonuses. As such, a new middle class was finally forming in the region of Kufstein. Though it was still in its early stages, the Barony of Kufstein was beginning to shift from the feudal era of nobles and peasants to an industrialized world with a multi-class structure. After having a few drinks like old times with Ludwig and talking about the past, present, and future, Berengar parted ways with his friend and returned to the castle. Everything was progressing smoothly. Now, all he needed was Linda's report from the spy network she was managing, and he could finally call it a night. The life of an ambitious man was never idle. Berengar bathed before returning to his room. Before long, Lind approached as per usual, but before she could pounce into Berengar's embrace, he stopped her and asked her the question on his mind. "So, how are things on your end?" She instantly knew what Berengar was referring to and pouted before she sat down next to him. She exhaled deeply and gave him the latest report. "Your network has penetrated the entirety of the barony and the vassals beneath your father. If anything even remotely similar to a plot against you appears, I will know about it. I've contacted my half-sister in Innsbruck and instructed her to set up a cell in her area. Before long, we will know everything that transpires in the seat of power of Tyrol. As for Ludolf, he is close to becoming a priest, and when he does so, he has orders to do as you have asked. Aside from that, your mouths are currently producing propaganda throughout the region about your exploits and inventions. They've come up with some interesting stories about how you are blessed by the divinity of Christ with knowledge of the future and will usher in a new era of peace and stability for the German people. I don't know who came up with that bullshit, but people are eating it up." After reporting to Berengar about her activities, she leaned into his chest and whispered in his ear. "Have I been a good girl?" Berengar smiled and stroked her glossy strawberry blonde hair before pushing her down upon the bed and whispered back to her. "You have been a very good girl, and I think you deserve a reward." After which, he spent the remainder of his waking hours with his lover's warm embrace. He wondered how long this peaceful and plentiful life could go on before the storm arrived. However, as of right now, that was not his concern. He needed to enjoy this time while it lasted. One thing was certain: his future would be filled with bloodshed, and that was not something he could escape now that he had embarked on the path to power. Chapter 45 Lambert's Birthday. Lambert awoke bright and early on this wonderful morning in the middle of July. Today was July 17, 1417, in other words, it was the teenage boy's 16th birthday. Today he would finally become a member of adulthood in this feudal world. His wedding to Lind would be held in a fortnight, and he was not very excited for that day. Currently, his relationship with Lind was cold, to say the least. She no longer punished him for his mistakes and barely took an interest in him as a person. She often walked right by him as if he did not even exist. On the other hand, she had become increasingly close to his elder brother and rival. Ever since her father left the young beauty in charge of managing his transaction with Berengar, she had sought every opportunity to spend time with his brother instead of himself. Now Lambert may be considered quite dense when it comes to relationships with the opposite sex, but even he was beginning to suspect Lind was having an affair with his elder brother. He even began to doubt the parentage of his so-called child. He had never once confronted his fiancée despite his worries, as he was too fearful of the truth. The more he thought about such things, the more he began to convince himself it was the truth. After all, during his last attempt on Berengar's life, somehow the information was leaked to Berengar's militia that the young lord was in trouble, and they marched in the dead of night to Wildschonau to save the bastard's life. To this day, he still had not caught the scoundrel who was responsible for leaking such information. Nevertheless, he could not bring himself to accuse Lind of such actions openly. After all, that would essentially be treason against the Count of Tyrol, who was her father. Lambert could not imagine Lind would betray her family for his brother, and thus his suspicions were kept in check. Still, he did not keep such thoughts in his head for long. He quickly got dressed as he rose out of his bed and decided to give his fiancée an early surprise. As such, he visited her quarters at the crack of dawn. However, when he knocked on her door, there was no response, which was quite worrisome. Thus he knocked louder and louder, but no matter how hard and loud he pounded on the woman's door, she did not respond. Lambert found that to be very strange. Where could she have gone at such an hour? Truth be told, she enjoyed a very early morning bath with her lover, but Lambert had no way of knowing this. As such, he waited at her door until she responded. Eventually, he saw Lind appear wearing her nightgown from the previous night, while her hair was damp as if she had just been in the bath. Her porcelain skin glistened under the light of dawn as it shone through the windows. The heavenly beauty looked at Lambert with shock as he stood outside her door, waiting for her arrival. Just how long had he been there waiting? Lambert was furious. Where had she been at such an ungodly hour, and why was she wearing her nightgown? "Where the hell have you been? I've been standing here pounding on your door for 30 minutes. Lind frowned as she noticed the tone Lambert was taking with her, and she coldly snubbed her nose at him before trying to enter her door. However, Lambert grabbed a hold of his fiancée and shoved her against the wall, his eyes filled with rage as he pressed her head firmly against the cold stone doorway. "I asked you a question." Lind returned his furious gaze with one of her own. However, after a few moments, her murderous gaze faded and she began to smile, which confused Lambert. Until he felt Berengar's iron grip rip into his shoulder, almost as if he were going to tear out the boy's clavicle. Lambert turned his head around with a horrified expression as he saw Berengar staring at him with a freezing glare. When the teenage boy looked into the eyes of his older brother, he could feel the cold gaze of death staring back at him. Thus he quickly released his grasp over Lind in fear. Berengar was also noticeably damp. However, that was not uncommon at this hour, as Berengar was known to wake up early and exercise heavily. He appeared to be in loose-fitting clothes he normally wore for such an occasion. Berengar still latched onto Lambert's shoulder and even dug his fingernails deeper into Lambert's doublet, inflicting pain on the boy. "What do you think you're doing? Is that any way to treat your fiancé?" Berengar's eyes were cold and expressionless. Yet his voice was thunderous and full of fury. This noticeably enraged tone held a hint of natural authority behind it and reminded Lambert of a tyrant sentencing a subject to death for an unforgivable crime. Berengar's eyes showed the indifference he felt towards Lambert's meaningless life, but his voice carried the weight of 1,000 stars. At that moment, Lambert felt like kneeling and begging for forgiveness, but he quickly grabbed a hold of his resolve and talked back to Berengar. After all, one day soon, he would be Baron, and Berengar would be a corpse. She's my fiancée. I can do what I wish with her. However, the moment he spoke those words, Berengar struck the boy with the back of his hand. It was such a violent blow that Lambert felt that he nearly lost a tooth from the impact. Berengar's icy gaze penetrated Lambert's soul, and the tone he now used was enough to awaken everyone who dwelled within this corridor. She is your fiancée, and you will treat her with respect. Before Lambert could make a proper retort, he was struck again by Berengar's hand. Lambert was outraged that he was treated in such a manner, yet he did not dare say another word at this point. Instead, Berengar looked over to Lind, his tyrannical expression softening as he did so. Lind, are you okay? Lambert noticed that Berengar was incredibly informal with his fiancée, which further ignited the fire within his heart. Yet, he stood there and did nothing. Lind, on the other hand, was flushed with excitement. She had never seen Berengar so angry over the way someone had treated her before. She wanted to jump into his arms at that moment but knew she could not do so for it would be inappropriate. As such, she merely nodded her head and bowed gracefully. I am fine. Thank you for your assistance in this matter. Berengar nodded and smiled at Lind before turning his attention back to Lambert, where he grabbed a hold of the boy's hair and shoved his face into the cold stone floor. He decided to give the boy a stern warning. After all, he would not tolerate any violence towards his women. If you so much as lay a hand on her again, I swear to our Father in heaven that I will grind you up into sausage and feed you to the pigs. Do I make myself clear? Lambert tried to escape from his grasp but could not do so. Berengar had grown quite strong since he had been reincarnated into this world. Noticing Lambert's defiance, he slammed the boy's face into the stone floor once more and yelled at him. Do I make myself clear? Lambert nodded his head and hissed through his teeth in an absolute fit of rage. I understand. The ruckus in which this incident caused had awoken Henrietta, who, after exiting her room, witnessed her two brothers engaged in a bloody struggle and Lind standing in the corner sneering at Lambert's fate. If the little girl did not like Lind before, she despised her now. Thus she approached the scene and tried to coax her two brothers into settling their dispute peacefully. Big brothers, what's going on? Berengar did not notice Henrietta approaching until now, and after seeing the worried expression on the little lowly's face, he let go of Lambert, dragged him to his feet and patted him off. Nothing much, just some friendly wrestling, right Lambert? Lambert immediately noticed the deathly glare Berengar was giving him and agreed to the ludicrous excuse Berengar had come up with on the spot. Absolutely, though Henrietta was still worried about the overall situation, she noticed that they had decided to act civil in her presence. Thus she approached them further, immediately switching the subject from whatever had caused such a scuffle. Lambert, I want pancakes for breakfast. Can we have pancakes? Though Lambert was a devious prick, he still had a soft spot for his little sister, much like Berengar, and had thus elected to put this feud to rest for now. As such, he smiled and patted Henrietta on the head before agreeing to her request. Sure, Henrietta, whatever you want. Henrietta ran into Lambert's arms and hugged him while staring down Lind with a look that said, I'm watching you. Lind was unfazed by the little girl's provocation as she had seen it many times since her arrival. Despite her best efforts, she had proven incapable of building a bond with either of the women of Berengar's family. Which was unfortunate, but she would not lose any sleep over it. Truly, aside from Berengar, it was the women of the von Kufstein family who had the best intuition. Eventually, Adela also left her quarters and saw what was transpiring. Though she did not know what had occurred, she instinctively felt it was something serious. She would make sure to ask Berengar about it later. After concluding the violent scene, the five of them walked into the dining hall, where they would await the arrival of the Baron and Baroness so that they could begin Lambert's birthday breakfast. Lately, Berengar had been ordering a beer with his breakfast, however today he suspiciously ordered a 2-liter flagon of milk to be brought to him. Despite his unusual behavior, nobody minded it. While drinking from his morning milk, Berengar could tell Lambert was glaring at him with a desire for revenge. Still, there was nothing the boy could do about it at this moment. Instead, he made a civil talk with the others. The group pretended as if the awkward scene in the corridor had never transpired. Lambert, on the other, was almost entirely certain that Lind was cheating on him with Berengar, but there was nothing he could do about it. Count Lothar would never believe his daughter would conspire against him and would probably have Lambert severely punished for suggesting such a thing. As such, all he could do was be cautious around her in the future. The group chatted for quite some time before the Baron and Baroness arrived. They were quite shocked to see that Berengar was here before them. Usually, he was either exercising or hard at work this early in the morning. Instead, he was sitting here peacefully conversing with the others. The Baron and Baroness sat down at the head of the table and ordered the food to be prepared and brought for them. While they waited for the food, they congratulated Lambert on his 16th birthday. Later that night, they would hold a coming-of-age ceremony for their second son. It was sure to be a festive occasion, one in which Berengar would take advantage of to cuck his brother to the fullest degree. He had plans to bed Lind in every part of the castle today without anyone knowing, including Lambert's bed. It was Berengar's way of saying happy birthday to his diabolical little brother who had already made multiple attempts on his life. Eventually, breakfast was served, and as Henrietta had suggested, German pancakes were one of the many delicacies served. Berengar, of course, dined entirely on wurst and sauerkraut. He would need a lot of protein if he were going to enjoy Lind to the extent he desired today. Thus he piled his plate with nothing but wurst and sauerkraut while drinking yet another giant 2L flagon of milk. Though the rest of the family was puzzled by his actions, Lind had an eerie suspicion about what he was planning for the upcoming hours and, for the first time, was slightly excited about Lambert's birthday. Adela looked at Berengar curiously, wondering why his breakfast was so weird. Berengar, are you not going to have anything else? Berengar shook his head and patted the girl's silky golden blonde hair. Sometimes a man has got to eat his wurst and sauerkraut. She did not know what to say, so she merely accepted his answer and moved on. As such, Berengar spent over an hour with his family discussing the schedule for the day while they feasted on their fabulous breakfast. Of course, he planned to be absent for most of it and only show up at the end drunk out of his mind. Still, he had prepared a gift for Lambert. The present he had planned for Lambert was the mini-balls he had used to kill the boy's assassins during his hunting trip. While cleaning up the corpses, he made sure to recover the mini-balls used to kill his opponents. He also added a fourth one which he had used to hunt a buck. The reason for this was simple: it was a symbolic gesture, 4 used bullets for the 4 men-at-arms killed during the hunting trip. As long as Lambert thought the 4th bullet came from his assassins, it would intimidate the boy. Essentially, Berengar was using violence and intimidation to pursue his political aims. In other words, this was a symbolic act of terror against his enemies. This was only the beginning of the day in which Lambert entered adulthood. There were many things to come as Berengar played mind games with his brother on a day that was supposed to be filled with celebration. Instead, Lambert would only feel dread and terror as his older brother would torment him in more ways than had already occurred. Chapter 46: Lambert's Birthday 2. After finishing the extravagant breakfast, Berengar departed from the family. They had many plans to set into place and a luxurious feast to prepare for the coming night. As such, Berengar used this time to enact his plan with Lind. He had already enjoyed her company in the bath, so he met up with Lind in secret on several occasions that day in various parts of the castle, where the couple released their carnal desires together. While that was going on, Lambert took out his pent-up fury on a training dummy with his longsword. The 16-year-old boy could not believe that today of all days, he had been humiliated in such a manner by his brother. Though he had wanted to keep a close eye on Lind, the sly girl had absconded the moment breakfast was over, and despite his attempts, Lambert ultimately failed to track her down. The image of her perfect porcelain skin dripping wet with the bathwater as her nightgown clung tightly to her heavenly curves could not escape his mind. Though it would normally be a pleasant memory to have, the scene that transpired afterward where Berengar was equally damp did nothing but create paranoia as he continued to suspect a relationship between the two. The young lord wanted to get to the bottom of this, though he could not. Accusing Lind without evidence would only create further tension between him and her father. Not to manage the harm it would cause to the fragile relationship he currently had with his fiancée. Truthfully, he did not want to know the truth if it was what he suspected. The boy wanted to tear his own heart out as he slashed at the training dummy's neck, decapitating it with a perfectly placed strike. In his mind, he envisioned the scene of removing Berengar's head from his shoulders, and at that moment, he felt cathartic. He swore to himself that sooner or later, he would have his vengeance on his older brother for the pain and suffering that had been inflicted on him this day. Of course, it did not even enter the boy's mind that he had brought these things upon himself by conspiring against his brother for the inheritance. After a long training session, Lambert entered the bath, where he cleansed his milky white skin from the sweat and grime accumulated throughout the violent display. As he gazed into his reflection within the pool of water, he could not help but feel inferior in appearance to his older brother. Though he had the charm of youth on his side, he did not have the princely features with which Berengar had been blessed. Instead, despite his youth, his face and body were more robust, as he had the characteristics of a knight. Which was attractive in its own right, and many women would prefer such a look. However, his fiancée obviously preferred the regal features of Berengar, which got under the boy's skin. He dashed the bathwater with his hand, causing a ripple to obscure the reflection before getting out of the pool of water and dressing in his attire. After getting out of the bath, he visited the kitchen where the chefs were busy baking a massive German cheesecake for the celebration that would occur later in the evening. He had no idea that Berengar and Lind were enjoying each other's embrace in his bed at this moment. Thus he continued to walk around the castle. Lately, he had noticed that the guards inside the castle had shifted from the usual troops adorned with brigandine and halberds to men garbed in the flamboyant attire of Berengar's militia while carrying their hand cannons. He was unaware that his father had selected Eckhard to be his next marshal, as it had not been publicly announced yet. However, unlike before when Lambert laughed at the peasants in their dirty clothes and their laughable hand cannons, their current equipment in which they issued began to intimidate Lambert. The men were clearly garbed in partial plate armor with a breastplate, backplate, gorget, and helmet, which were all made of blackened steel. These guards did not pay the slightest bit of attention to Lambert as he passed by. Lambert walked out upon the castle's ramparts and saw more of these men acting as sentries upon the castle's walls. They were currently in the process of aligning Berengar's cannons onto the ramparts. These cannons were not the 12-pound field guns used by the militia, but 24-pound siege cannons developed by Berengar and recently put into production with the intent of being static defensive guns mounted on the castle's walls. With Eckhard being made the marshal, even if it was not common knowledge at the moment, the man had begun to transition the old garrison into Berengar's training and re-outfitting them with the modern equipment. In truth, the men Lambert saw staffing the castle were the same men that always acted as the garrison. They were just equipped with the latest weapons of Berengar's design and were being trained in their use. Of course, some of Berengar's men had replaced those who had been purged from the castle garrison's ranks for being loyal to Lambert, but most of the troops stationed at Castle Kufstein were the same men who had always been there. After traveling across the castle observing the changes occurring, Lambert could not help but feel that Berengar was winning in the war. They were fighting for the succession of their father's title. Lately, his allies were beginning to back out of his plans after the death of Marshal Friedhelm, and hostile forces now surrounded him within his own home. Things were not going well for the youth, who was now in a difficult position. Count Lothar of Tyrol kept pressuring the boy into another assassination attempt on Berengar's life, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. Berengar had won the favor of the people. Thus he could no longer count on them to poison him. The castle guard who was loyal to himself had now been replaced by forces loyal to Berengar, and the man had quite possibly won over his fiancée and was using her to spy on him. As long as Berengar remained in Kufstein, it would be challenging to claim his life. Worse yet, Lambert was now aware that rumors were spreading of Berengar's divine powers to see the future and that the inventions he had implemented were gifts from God to the people of Germany that would lead them into a new era. Many of the common folk were beginning to treat him like he was some saint. Suddenly Lambert had an epiphany: if he could not get the people to turn on Berengar, and the feudal powers were no longer supporting Lambert, there was only one potential ally he could call upon, which had enough power and authority to end Berengar's life. A devilish smile appeared across Lambert's face as he realized that this war was far from over. If he could gain the church's support and accuse Berengar of heresy, then it did not matter if he was a baron's son and heir. The Inquisition had the power and authority to deal with any potential heretics, no matter their social status. As such, he quickly rushed to his room to draft a letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck to make accusations of heresy against his elder brother. By the time Lambert reached his room, Berengar and Lind had already moved onto another part of the castle to continue their day of debauchery. As such, Lambert was entirely unaware of what had recently transpired in his own bed. He quickly got to his desk and pulled out parchment, a quill, and some ink where he began to draft a letter for a plea of assistance from the bishop. In this letter, Lambert brought up concerns about Berengar being the embodiment of the 7 deadly sins and consorting with witches and demons to gain forbidden knowledge that had allowed him to invent these new devices that were being implemented in Kufstein, and how Berengar was spreading blasphemy about his divinity. The list of concerns in which Lambert brought up was both extensive and almost entirely fictitious. After drafting the letter, he brought it to the local priest of the church within Kufstein. Currently, Deacon Ludolf was working alongside the priest on matters of the ecclesiarchy. Thus Ludolf, a high-ranking member of Berengar's spy network and trusted ally, was present when Lambert rushed in to gain the signature of the local priest for his approval of these concerns. Father, I have some concerns about my brother's erratic behavior lately and have decided to draft a formal inquiry to the bishop so that we may discover the truth about these matters. I would like you to read about my concerns and give your support. The priest smiled when he saw Lambert. The boy was considered a pious and graceful youth worthy of the title of baron. Unfortunately, he was born the second son and thus would not inherit the lands. The priest's opinion of Berengar was not as high as Lambert's. After all, Berengar had only shown his face in the church once in the past few months. He was beginning to believe that the young man had become an apostate. When the priest read the letter Lambert had drafted, it was as if his suspicions were confirmed. Without any evidence for the claims in which Lambert had presented, the priest signed away his endorsement on the spot. It would be good for an unfaithful wretch like Berengar to be removed from his position, especially if these concerns turned out to be legitimate. The old priest smiled at Lambert and patted the boy on the shoulder. Lambert, my child, you have always been a faithful servant to the Lord, and I will gladly endorse your letter to the bishop. If what you say is true, there is a dire need for the Inquisition to get involved. We can only pray that the devil and his worshippers are routed out from the halls of your ancestors and that the glory of God can be returned to these lands. Lambert smiled gracefully and bowed to the priest. Thank you, Father. I knew I could count on your support in these troubling times. Afterward, the priest saw Lambert off as he raced back to the castle to send the letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck. When he returned, he was given an odd stare by Ludolf, who could not help but voice his concerns. Father, you cannot possibly believe that a single thing written in that letter was the truth. It is obvious the boy is scheming to take over his brother's position as heir to the barony. The priest frowned at Ludolf as he chastised him greatly for his words. Whether it is true or not is of no concern of the church. If Berengar were to inherit his father's position, he would use the power in his hands to be rid of the church's influence. We cannot allow such ideas to take hold over the people's minds, especially the nobility who stand to benefit from them. It is better to have a God-fearing baron like Lambert in charge who will obey the will of the papacy than a godless heathen like Berengar who would challenge the authority of the Holy See. At that moment, Ludolf knew everything Berengar had said about the church was true. They were corrupt beyond measure. They were willing to torture a seemingly righteous man to death over nonsensical claims simply because he posed a minor threat to their power. These words by the priest of Kufstein ultimately convinced Ludolf that the church needed to be reformed. However, he stood there in silence, simply nodding his head at the priest's words. For now, he would have to warn Berengar of the danger that lies ahead. Ludolf would one day come to realize that this one decision by the authorities of the church would cause Berengar to view the papacy as the greatest obstacle in his rise to power and would cause endless bloodshed in the struggle for secular authority. After Lambert returned to the castle, he quickly sent the letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck, though it would take time to approve the Inquisition's interference in Kufstein. Lambert was certain that this action would lead his brother to his demise. For in his mind, how could a lowly baron's heir defy the might of the Inquisition? If Lambert knew what his brother would have in store for the church's forces upon their arrival, he would have soiled himself in fear of the mad lengths to which Berengar was willing to enact to ensure his dominance. Chapter 47 Lambert's Birthday 3. After successfully sending the letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck, Lambert had a wide smile on his face. His otherwise foul mood had taken a turn for the better as he could finally see an end in sight for his brother. He also wrote another letter informing Count Lothar of Tyrol of his plans to involve the church in their schemes. By branding Berengar as a heretic, they would essentially get the entirety of the Christian world to unite against him. Or so they believed. At the very least, the Inquisition would not let the young man go so easily. It was not until the evening that Lambert finally left his room, where he returned to the kitchen to see his family gathered around the table with a German cheesecake produced for him. It was a relatively recent tradition that popped up in the German world, but it was not until Berengar arrived that it had spread to Kufstein. After all, the man wanted an excuse to eat cake. Since it was a tradition that was bound to spread across Europe eventually and had already taken root in some areas of the German-speaking regions, Berengar took it upon himself to introduce it to Kufstein for Lambert's birthday. It would seem like he was generous. In reality, he just wanted an excuse to cheat on his diet and feast on the delicious cake. It was just a pity that chocolate did not exist in Europe yet. Otherwise, he would have had his chefs cook up some German chocolate cake, which Berengar was accustomed to having during his childhood birthdays from his previous life. Berengar, of course, took the liberty to add the candles himself and start that tradition a few centuries early. It was a birthday, and Berengar would be damned if he did not do it right. It truly did not matter if it was for his greatest enemy. An excuse to start a tradition is an excuse to start a tradition. The family sat around the table and lit the candles, where Berengar stared at his little brother with a gentle smile. Make a wish, Lambert, then blow out the candles. As such, Lambert thought to himself. Make a wish? I don't see the point, but whatever, I wish you would drop dead. Afterward, he did what Berengar had said and exhaled deeply onto the candles, snuffing their flames in the process. Unfortunately for him, his wish did not become a reality. Afterward, everyone lined up to give the presents they had acquired to Lambert. From his mother Gisela, he received a fine doublet manufactured in one of Berengar's factories. From his father, he received a new steel longsword superior to the one he previously had, as it was made from high-quality, high-carbon Bessemer steel. He received a childish drawing of the family from Henrietta, and from Lind, he received nothing. His fiancée had not given him a gift at all. Well, technically, she had. He was just not aware of it. Her gift to Lambert was cheating on him with his older brother in his own bed. Finally, it was Berengar's turn, and everyone expected him to give something outlandish to Lambert. After all, Berengar was in charge of the industrial sector within the realm. Yet before Berengar gave him the box which contained his present, he said something which unnerved Lambert. My present is a trophy from my hunting trip in which I went on with our father not too long ago. Open it up and see what it is, little brother. I'm sure it will amuse you. When Berengar said those words, he had a devilish grin on his face which gave Lambert a bad feeling about the present within his grasp. His hands began to tremble as he slowly unwrapped the box and looked inside. In the small box were 4 mini-ball projectiles, slightly bent out of shape and stained with blood. It was truly a curious thing. However, the words that came out of Berengar's words spread terror to every corner of Lambert's mind. I managed to dig those out of the corpses of my kills. It's a trophy to the success of my hunt, and I would like to dedicate such a meaningful part of my past to you, little brother. It was a weird present to give to Lambert on his birthday, and thus it confused everyone except for Lambert, Lind, and Berengar. He kept looking up between the malicious smile on Berengar's face and down at the blood-stained bullet-like projectiles in his hands. It instantly clicked in his head what Berengar meant. Lambert had sent 4 assassins to deal with Berengar on the hunt, and there were 4 bloody pieces of lead in this box. Did that mean that Berengar had killed those men after all? That they had not run away in the first place? How was that possible? According to Berengar, the hand cannons did not have a very effective range and a long reload speed. How did he manage to get off 4 shots and perfectly kill all 4 men? This was very clearly a threat by Berengar to Lambert, and there were only 3 people in the room who realized exactly what Berengar's intent was with this gift. However, the more Lambert tried to rationalize it, the more he realized Berengar couldn't kill the men with these lead balls. His brother was probably aware of the fact that Lambert had sent assassins after him and was messing with his mind. It was not as if Berengar could fire his hand cannon at the distance of a longbow. That would be absurd. Thus the 16-year-old boy finally calmed himself down and returned Berengar's gesture with a gracious smile. Thank you, Berengar. I will treasure it always. Berengar smiled back to Lambert and nodded in approval. I am sure you will. To everyone else in the room, it would appear that the 2 brothers were quite friendly to one another and were on good terms. Sadly, such a thing could not be further from the truth. If they knew that the two boys were fighting tooth and nail to find a way to put one another in the grave, it would surely cause a disturbance. After accepting his gifts, Lambert immediately dug into his cheesecake with a satisfied expression. He did not know the genius who invented such a thing, but it was truly a slice of heaven. The family mingled together as they discussed the future while snacking on the cake. Finally, Berengar mentioned something sure to antagonize his little brother. "So, little brother, I hear your wedding has been moved up. It should be just around the corner now that you're an adult, should it not?" Gisella's expression instantly stiffened as she stared menacingly at Lind. By now, Lind was used to such glances from the Baroness and could not care less. Lambert, on the other hand, nearly choked on his cake. Berengar was clearly trying to aggravate him, especially now that Lambert had suspicions about Linda's potential relationship with his brother. However, this marriage was something he could not back out of now. Not unless he could prove he was not the father of Linda's child. However, that would be not easy to do, and he did not even know where to begin to do so. Essentially, it was her word against his, and her father would never believe that the girl had been impregnated by a man other than her fiancé. Of course, she would never admit to such a thing, and as such, he was basically screwed. The girl he once admired as the most beautiful woman in the world was not only an enormous bitch, but quite the slut too. At least in Lambert's eyes. From Berengar's perspective, she was an incredibly loyal woman. She was chaste until the night they met, and the only reason things went down the path they had was that she drugged him. Eventually, Lambert smiled and hissed between his teeth as he could not think of an escape route. "Yes, I look forward to it every day. Isn't that right, dear?" he said as he glanced over to Lind, hoping to get a reaction from the girl. Now that they were both 16 years old, she no longer held that seniority over him. Lind looked over at Lambert with disgust in her eyes. However, despite her true feelings, she pretended to be kind to Lambert since it was his birthday and his family was around. "Of course, I wouldn't want any other man as my husband." The only person in the room who bought that line was Sigurd. Even Adela could tell the young woman's disgust towards her fiancé. It was not that she was a bad actor, it is just that all of the women in the room already had some suspicion about where Linda's affection truly lied, and Berengar obviously knew her true self better than anyone. Gisela truly detested the young woman who her second son was about to marry. If she had the authority, she would have cast the girl out from her home long ago. Hopefully, when Berengar became regent, she could convince him as a mother to use his authority to move Lambert and his detestable wife into one of the estates within the town of Kufstein, which were built for the lodgings of the noblemen who visited for Berengar's engagement ceremony. Though she suspected that Berengar was having an affair with Lind, surely the boy would end things once the girl had been married to his brother. Of course, in reality, Lambert would be excluded from the best parts of marriage as Lind would use her pregnancy as an excuse not to sleep with Lambert and would continue to maintain her distance from him even after marriage. After this morning's scramble with Berengar, he truly feared his brother would feed him to the pigs if he forced himself upon the girl. The look in Berengar's eye was inhuman and murderous with intent. He had no doubt Berengar would be so cruel to his own flesh and blood. Especially since they were already both plotting each other's downfall. After a long day of festivities and celebration, the family finally returned to their rooms. As always, Berengar attempted to get some work done before going to bed. He was currently designing public schools to be built in every populated region of the barony and the schedule in which not only the children but the adult peasants would have to go through to learn their basic education. It was an expensive investment that would take away from the massive productivity he was currently experiencing, but it would be worth it in the long run. An educated populace was a productive populace. Not to mention he would be able to use the public school system to indoctrinate the population of Kufstein into being loyal to him and his reformist cause. Thus among the list of blueprints he was creating was the printing press, so he could give everyone a copy of the Bible to study in their own time, and of course, the education materials they would need to cover as a class. The only problem he faced was finding educated individuals to teach the masses. Though he was certain that among the contacts he had made during his engagement ceremony, he could find some educated and pampered nobles to act as teachers for a few hours each day. Thus he spent the remainder of his work hours establishing a proper curriculum, designs for school buildings, the printing press, and of course, the education manuals for each student. By the time Lind knocked on his door, it was well past midnight. Though they were both worn out from their combined exercise throughout the day, they would still enjoy each other's comfort as they spooned together and fell to sleep in one another's arms. After all, it had been a pretty exciting day for the couple. In the coming days, Lind would begin building a case against Lambert for the man she loved. Time was of the essence, and it was best to acquire these things before Berengar became regent, thus he would be able to arrest Lambert the very minute he gained the power of a baron. However, for now, the two were exhausted from their previous playtime, and simply held onto one another's loving embrace and fell asleep in each other's arms. Whatever threats crossed their path in the future, the couple would face it together. Chapter 48 Gathering Evidence. Lind sat quietly at a table, enjoying a cup of tea. Currently, she was within the local tea shop that had recently appeared in the town of Kufstein. Sitting in front of her was Ludolf, who was currently dressed in dark robes whose hood concealed his appearance. At the moment, he was informing the spymaster of the information which he had received about Lambert's newest plot against Berengar. To any onlookers, they were merely a young lady and young man enjoying tea together. However, the gravity of the topic in which they discussed in hushed voices was immense. Ludolf took a sip from his tea before expressing his concerns to the woman who handled Berengar's spy network. Lambert has written a letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck, which the head priest of Kufstein has sponsored. It contains many accusations labeled against Berengar. The most important charge is that he lies with witches and consorts with demons. When the bishop reads this letter, he will send for the Inquisition to investigate the matters. As far as the Inquisition is concerned, you probably are aware that they do not care what the truth is and will try to execute Berengar as a heretic in order to solidify the church's power in the region. Lind was shocked when she heard such news. Lambert was truly getting desperate if he tried to rope the church into his schemes. Though after thinking it through, such actions did not surprise her. After all, the boy had been cornered by Berengar lately. Many of his allies were beginning to think twice about supporting him any further, and even Linda's father, the Count of Tyrol, was beginning to think about cutting his losses. If she had not become pregnant, Count Lothar would have dropped his support for Lambert. After coming to her senses, Lind smiled and thanked the deacon for the important information he had provided her. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I will inform the sovereign of Lambert's schemes. I trust he will have a sufficient answer to the problem when it rears its ugly head. Is there anything else I should be aware of?" Ludolf smiled at Lind as there was more good news that the man had for the woman. He took a bite out of the Pfeffernuss cookie before continuing with his report. "There's an ally of Lambert's who is starting to have second thoughts. If we can get to him and convince him to switch sides, he may be able to testify about Lambert's misdeeds." Lind eyed Ludolf cautiously as she thought about his words before speaking up. "Who is he, and how did you come by this information?" Ludolf chuckled as he sipped from his teacup before responding to Linda's inquiry. "That foolish boy Esser Ingbert has confided with me his transgressions and has sought advice on how to proceed. After the death of Ulrich and Friedhelm, he is beginning to fear the worst. If he finds out that Lambert's own fiancée is on Berengar's side, then he will no longer have the confidence to support Lambert and may even turn on him entirely." Lind mulled over Ludolf's suggestion as she took a sip from her glass. It was a risky plan. If Ingbert learned where her allegiance truly lied, he could instead report it to Lambert or her father, which would put her in a precarious position. He would need to be silenced and quickly if he were to make such a foolish mistake. Ultimately, she concluded that the potential reward outweighed the risk involved in such a scheme and nodded in approval of Ludolf's plan. "Is there anything else I should know?" Ludolf did have one more piece of important information to inform the listener about. As such, he smiled underneath his dark hood, which was unnoticeable by any bystanders, and spilled the details. "The von Thiercy family is investigating the marshal's death. For whatever reason, Lambert is their biggest suspect. As such, I have communicated with the Speaker of the Cell in Thiercy, and he has been using his forces to lead the von Thiercy family to the conclusion that Ulrich's treason had something to do with Friedhelm's passing. As such, they have dispatched an emissary to Wildschönau under the guise of diplomatic relations. I have no idea what such an investigation may yield, but it is something to be wary of." Lind finished her tea and snacks before standing up from the table preparing to leave. "If that is all, then I have work to do, until we meet again, Speaker." Ludolf nodded at Lind as she left the tea shop. Afterward, he snuck back to the church, where he continued his work as a deacon. Lind, on the other hand, had many plans to set into motion. With these developments, she may fully be able to obtain the evidence needed to bring charges against Lambert. However, Berengar would never do such a thing so long as his father remained in power. However, the moment the old Baron left for the battlefield, leaving Berengar in control of the barony, he would have what he needed to arrest his brother and bring an end to this feud once and for all. For now, the young woman embarked towards the manor of the Heltzer family, where Esser Ingbert was currently residing. She would need to convince him to switch sides if things were to progress the way she had envisioned. As such, she quickly got into a carriage and traveled across the barony to the land presided over by Ingbert's father, a knight in the servitude of Sigurd by the name of Helmer. Hopefully, she would be able to return to Kufstein Castle by the end of the day so she could spend the night with her lover and master. She did not wish to spend the night halfway across the region in some lowly manner. Thus she wore a pouting expression as she sat in the carriage, which traversed the land at a relatively stable pace. Chapter 49 Gathering Evidence 2. While Lind was off traveling towards the Heltzer Manor, Lord Arnulf von Thiersee was currently standing in Wildschonau Castle with his retinue. He had just arrived and was currently paying his respects to the new Lord of Wildschonau, who just so happened to be a small child. It was a pity that both of these two lords had lost their fathers so close to one another. Granted, they were under vastly different circumstances, but he could understand the pain the von Wildschonau family was currently going through. Though the lord did not bow to the child known as Theobald von Wildschonau, he still acted respectfully. After all, they were two lords of the same status, and as such, there was no need for overbearing formality. Lord Theobald, I offer my condolences in the loss of your father, Ulrich. I have come to pay my respects to your family. Theobald was nearly 8 years old. Despite this, he had been under strict tutelage by his regent and was aware of the matters occurring across the realm. Thank you, Lord Arnulf, that means a lot to me. I also wish to say how sorry I am that your father passed so suddenly. He was truly a staple of the realm. You are free to stay here for the time being, and I will have my servants attend to your every wish. I am happy to see that there are still men of conscience who will not forsake my family for the foolish actions of my late father. Arnulf smiled at the flattery. Clearly, the regent had prepared such an elaborate statement for such a small child. As such, Arnulf decided to entertain the regent's efforts and returned the young boy's compliments. You are wise for your age, and I am happy to see that you have good counsel. I will take you up on your offer and enjoy my stay to the best of my abilities. I thank you for the hospitality you have shown me. After exchanging pleasantries, Arnulf was led to his quarters, where he spent the remainder of the day acting cordially with the family. During the evening, he dined with them and found that the widow of Ulrich was still grieving heavily for her husband's passing. She had on several occasions made treasonous statements blaming Berengar for the death of Ulrich and cursing his name. She had completely forgotten that she was in the presence of a guest and had let her true feelings about the future Baron come forth. It was not until it was late at night that he decided to sneak out of his quarters and personally investigate the late Lord Ulrich's personal study. As such, he quietly sneaked through the corridors of the castle. He was extra cautious about patrols that were ongoing throughout the night. On one occasion, he was nearly discovered by a guard who was following his route. If it were not because the man was half asleep, Arnulf would have a difficult time explaining his actions. Eventually, he found his way to the location where he desired entry without getting caught in the act. After picking the lock, Arnulf snuck inside with a small oil lamp in his hand. It was only after the door was properly closed behind him that he lit the lamp to provide illumination in his search for evidence. After spending several hours searching through every scrap of paper in the office, Arnulf realized that even if Ulrich's treason was somehow connected to his father's death like he was led to believe, all evidence of his treacherous actions would have been seized by Sieghard's forces when they searched for proof of his guilt. Or so the man thought. However, after stumbling over a fallen chalice, the man clumsily bumped into the bookcase where a Bible fell to the ground. However, when the Bible flopped to the ground, it revealed that its contents had been hollowed out, and hidden inside the holy book was a small black ledger that was unmarked. After flipping through the ledger, Arnulf could not believe his eyes. The book was a secret journal kept by Ulrich with details of his shadowy dealings with Lambert and the Count of Tyrol. Every conversation Ulrich ever had with the two men about their plans to eliminate Berengar was recorded in great detail within this ledger. The reason this book existed must have been as a form of leverage. If Ulrich were ever caught and left to hang by his sinister partners, he would use this as a means to buy his life. Unfortunately, the man had perished on the battlefield, and he was never able to trade such valuable information for his own security. Due to it being hidden in a Bible within the bookcase, Sieghard's men who handled the investigation never even thought to open it. The most important part of this information was that Arnulf's father was never mentioned in the book. As a loyal son who considered his father the marshal, the personification of justice, Arnulf concluded that Lambert had assassinated his father because his father had discovered the boy's plot to commit fratricide and usurp the barony. He had to get this ledger to the Baron as quickly as possible if this information was true. However, the more he thought about it, he figured Berengar must be aware of his brother's attempt on his life. If he handed the ledger over to Berengar to act as evidence against Lambert, Arnulf and his family would most likely be able to reap more rewards. Due to a misconception created out of ignorance of his father's moral failings, the von Thiercy family would from this day forward become ardent supporters of Berengar in all of his actions. After tidying up the study to make it appear as if he were never there, Arnulf snuffed his oil lamp and returned to his room, where he carefully read through the entire contents of the ledger he had found. It was truly a damning piece of evidence, one that, when combined with the in which Berengar's network had collected, would allow Berengar to build an ironclad case against Lambert. The Lord had no way of knowing that he would be aiding his father's killer in his plans to ensure dominion over the realm. Chapter 50, Gathering Evidence 3. During the time in which Arnulf von Thiercy stayed at the castle in Wildschönau, Lind had visited the humble manor of the Heltzer family. A family of landed knights in service to Baron Sieghard and the von Kufstein family. When Lady Lind von Habsburg knocked on the door to the manor, Sir Ingbert was surprised to see her presence. Never in a million years would he imagine that the angel of his heart would knock upon his own door. Yet here she was, appearing before him like a goddess descending from the heavens. The young man quickly got a hold of himself and allowed her access to his home. He immediately prepared some wine for the young woman whom he greatly desired and inquired about her reason for visiting. "I must say I am shocked to see you here. Is there a reason, in particular, you have come to my humble abode?" Lind looked around to see if anyone else was nearby before asking her question. Her flawless porcelain skin glistened under the sunlight that shone through the windows. "Is anyone else here?" Ingbert shook his head as he put down the glass of wine on the table in front of the young enchantress before taking a sip of his own. However, to his dismay, she refused the drink. "I am sorry, I am afraid that I am not able to drink right now." She immediately motioned to her stomach. At first, he did not understand what she meant, but after a moment, he quickly realized the secret she was trying to tell him. His face immediately became flushed as he understood what she meant. He cursed at Lambert inwardly in his mind for being lucky enough to impregnate such a heavenly beauty. Eventually, he forced himself to put on a smile and hissed through his teeth. "Lambert is a lucky man." Lind could not help but smile at the man's appearance. His envy was incredibly obvious, but surely the young man before her had to know that she was in a league far above his own. After shoving the glass of wine away from herself, Lind began to twist the boy to do her bidding. That's actually why I'm here. I heard that you were thinking of backing out of Lambert's plots. Is this true?" Though Ingbert did not want to admit his cowardice in front of the woman he lusted after, he had no choice. The way she stared at him sent him into a trance where he could not deny her wishes. "It's true. So has Lambert sent you here to ensure my loyalty?" The thought of how she came to acquire such knowledge did not even cross the dull boy's mind in the slightest. Instead, Lind used the boy's affection for her to win him over to Berengar's cause. Actually, it is quite the opposite. Ingbert stared at her with a blank expression. He could not tell in the slightest what she meant by such a thing. Before he knew it, Lind had put her acting skills to work and had begun to form a tear in her eye as she cast a line for Ingbert to bite into. "Lambert is an exceptionally cruel man. He has beaten me on many occasions. In my despair, I ran into the arms of his brother Berengar, the very man my fiancée conspires to kill. I'm in fear for my life as I have begun to suspect that Lambert knows of my relationship with his brother and will stop at nothing to get revenge. I beg of you, please switch sides, and help Berengar obtain the evidence he needs to lock that monster away." By now, the waterworks were in full effect, and they had begun to cascade down Linda's divine heart-shaped face. the sight of which instantly enraged Ingbert. He could not accept that Lambert had abused such a kind and caring woman, driving her into the arms of someone like Berengar. Though Ingbert was not particularly fond of Berengar, the fact that Lambert would lay his hands on Lind outraged him, and Linda's acting was more than enough to convince him to switch sides. As such, he tried to placate the crying woman before him. "I promise, I will do everything in my power to make it so that bastard will never lay his hands on you again. With what I know, I can act as a witness against Lambert's treachery and ensure that he is in no position to harm you or your child." Lind continued to sniffle, but after some time, the tears ended as she questioned Ingbert's sincerity. "Really?" Ingbert nodded with a foolish grin on his face as he confirmed his allegiance. "Of course." After hearing that her plan was a rousing success, Lind jumped into Ingbert's arms and hugged the young man platonically as she thanked him for his aid. Thank you so much. I knew I could count on you." Ingbert had no way of knowing that he was being manipulated by a pretty face and the man behind her. Instead, he enjoyed the brief moment Lind wrapped her arms around him with a satisfied grin on his face. However, the moment was far too short for his liking, and she quickly escaped from his grasp. After doing such a thing, she internally felt like she needed a bath. After recovering his senses, Ingbert voiced his concerns. Do you wish to stay the night? I'm certain I can find some space for you." Lind shook her head and put on a solemn expression. "I'm afraid not. If I'm gone for too long, Lambert will begin to suspect I am up to something. I must return to the castle quickly, or else I will have to suffer his wrath." Though Ingbert felt dismayed that her stay was so brief, he was happy just to assist the young lady and would soon meet with Berengar to discuss Lambert's downfall. Just like that, Berengar had gained another key piece of evidence in his future efforts to bring justice upon Lambert and his dastardly schemes. After leaving the manor, Lind got into her carriage and rode off towards Kufstein Castle. She could not wait to tell her master the good news. Hopefully, he would reward her for the efforts she had to go to. Of course, he also might punish her for hugging another man, even if it was just a friendly gesture. Berengar was quite possessive with his property. Either way, she would enjoy the treatment she received from the man she loved. Chapter 51 Gathering Evidence IV. A few days had passed and Berengar was currently sitting at his desk in his room. Surrounding him were three people: Lind, his lover and slave; Ingbert, formerly a close ally of his brother, now a turncoat; and Arnulf von Thierse, who was an important vassal to his father. All three of these people could provide the evidence in which Berengar needed to justify the cruel actions he had planned for his brother. A tyrant could do as he pleased, but to engage in cruelty and be praised for it by his people would require evidence of wrongdoing and well-placed propaganda. He did not wish to be known as another kinslayer. Instead, he wanted to be known as the man who was willing to go to great lengths to ensure that justice was acted out against wrongdoers, even if one of those wrongdoers was his own flesh and blood. He was currently listening to Arnulf discuss his terms for providing the ledger to Berengar with an indifferent expression on his face. "I desire a position on your council when you take up your position as regent and certain assurances that Lambert will be dealt with accordingly. I do not wish to see leniency on his behalf because he is your brother." Berengar tapped his finger on his desk thrice as he listened to the demands presented to him by the Lord. After sighing heavily, he began to present his counter-offer. "I assure you that there is no love lost between my brother and me. When he is charged and found guilty, he will be given an appropriate punishment for his crimes. As for the position of counselor, I am a man who rewards merit. If you can prove yourself to be the most suitable candidate for the position you desire, I have no problems choosing you to fulfill it. However, if someone better appears in time, know that I have no qualms removing you from that position." Arnulf stared into Berengar's icy sapphire eyes and felt intimidated by the pressure he was receiving. Sure enough, Berengar was not an easy man to negotiate with. However, he honestly could not think of a valid retort to Berengar's counter. As such, he acquiesced to his second demand and returned with a better offer. "Fine, but I want compensation." Berengar maintained his indifferent expression as he glared at Arnulf. There was no hesitation in his voice as he inquired about the details of such a thing. "In what form?" Arnulf gulped at the response. He did not explicitly state he wanted money, he merely desired compensation, and Berengar had caught that immediately. Clearly, the young lord was very shrewd in diplomatic affairs. The man looked over at the suit of armor Berengar had lying in the corner of his room with envy in his eyes. Though it was only half plate, it was truly magnificent in design, and he deeply desired a set of his own. A good suit of armor was worth a fortune in this time period, and if he were to march to war alongside Sigurd, he wanted superior protection than the set he currently had. Your factories produce plate armor such as that in high quantities, is that correct? Berengar scoffed at Arnulf's request. He thought too much of Arnulf and assumed the man would want his armies equipped with such magnificent technology. That was a demand which Berengar would never allow to come to fruition. My factories are currently busy producing the equipment necessary to arm my forces. I do not have the means of production to create enough to equip yours. Arnulf shook his head and stopped Berengar before he could continue with his train of thought. You misunderstand my intent, my lord. What I desire is a single set of plate armor for myself. Can this be arranged? Berengar was stunned when he heard this request. It was a far more reasonable offer than what he had initially estimated to be Arnulf's thoughts. Of course, a full set of plate armor was an outrageous expense, but that was because of the limited ability of this era to produce steel in high enough quantity to create such a thing. Not to mention the intensive labor required for personal fitting of the armor. However, Berengar had more steel than he knew what to do with at the moment. With the use of advanced manufacturing processes like trip hammers in his factories, the labor would be far less extensive, and as such, far less expensive to manufacture a set of full-plate armor. After careful consideration, Berengar agreed to the terms Arnulf had stated. As such, he rose from his chair and extended his hand to the lord in front of him. Then, if that is all, I believe we have come to an agreement. The two men shook hands, signaling the dawn of a new alliance united against their common enemy. After agreeing to the terms, Arnulf handed over the ledger to Berengar for safekeeping, and Berengar promised Arnulf that he would get his set of armor within a reasonable amount of time. The style of armor in which he would craft for the man would be in that of the famous Maximilian set, which German knights and men at arms used during the 16th century of Berengar's previous life. After the two had concluded their negotiations, Berengar turned his focus to Ingbert, who was waiting patiently for his turn to speak. When Berengar motioned for Ingbert to voice his concerns, the man kneeled before him. My lord, I confess to conspiring against you alongside your brother in the past and openly ask for forgiveness. I offer you my written and verbal testimonies of the wicked deeds I have witnessed Lambert engaging in as my sincerest apologies for my actions. The young knight's actions slightly amused Berengar. He never really cared for Ingbert, but somehow Lind had managed to gain his support in the fight against Lambert. After all, he had punished her severely the night before for hugging him. Even if it was an act, he could not allow his slave to touch other men. Though he held no grudge against Ingbert for that scene, as such, he motioned for Ingbert to rise as Berengar gave his decree. Rise, Sir Ingbert. I shall spare you under the condition that you stay true to your words and aid me in bringing down my brother. Ingbert rose from his kneeling position with a wide smile on his face. He was not doing this for Berengar but for Lind, who desperately needed his help. Or so he thought. The reality is that aside from the one encounter with Lambert in the hallway, he had never laid a hand on her before, nor would he ever again, as the boy was so clearly traumatized by Berengar's threat. With these new pieces of evidence and the letter from Lambert's previous attempt on his life, Berengar now had everything he needed to charge his brother with attempted fratricide and treason. With this evidence in his hands, he could justifiably execute his brother the moment he gained control over the seat of power in Kufstein. Now all he needed to do was wait for his father to march off to war, leaving him in control of the barony. Of course, first, he would have to deal with the threat of the Inquisition breathing down his neck, but to him, the Church and their attempts to intimidate him into compliance were merely child's play. If the Church wanted to provoke a tyrant, then he was happy to play the part. Berengar would soon show his enemies what happens when they conspire against the Tyrant of Steel. Chapter 52. No father should have to execute his own child. Berengar stood in a room alone with his mother, Gisela. The Baroness had quite enough of Berengar's fling with Lind and was currently confronting her eldest son about his misdeeds. She stared up at her son with a look of scorn on her regal face. He was quite a bit taller than her, however. This did not prevent her from leering into his gemstone-like sapphire eyes. There was a degree of arrogance in her baby boy's gaze which caught the mature beauty off guard as she lectured him. Until now, I have put up with your little escapades with that vile woman because I thought you would grow sick of her company, and I could use it as an excuse to be rid of the vixen once and for all. Now I can see she has dug her claws into both of you two brothers." Berengar could not help but chuckle at his mother's wording. She made it appear as if he was being manipulated by Lind when she was actually quite the obedient slave. This laughter did not ease his mother's fury as she continued to glare at her own errant son. What is so funny? Berengar knew that his mother was furious with his behavior, but he would never allow her to get rid of his favorite toy. As such, a wicked grin spread across his lips as he sneered at his mother's ferocious display. "Lind does not have her claws dug into me, as you proclaim. In fact, the situation is quite the opposite. She obeys my every will and whim like an obedient little girl. It was true that she was the one to approach me, but I am the one who dominates in this relationship. I have no plans to get rid of her anytime soon, as she has proven to be quite the excellent concubine. Plus, as I am sure you have suspected, the child within her is my own." He had no problems revealing this information to his mother. The woman had long since suspected this to be the truth, and he knew the woman would never betray him. Blood is thicker than water, and despite her opinion of Lind, she would not disgrace her family's reputation by making such information public. However, Gisella's reaction was out of his expectation. She slapped Berengar across his cheek and chastised him for his behavior. "Do you have any idea how scandalous your actions are? You have cuckolded your own brother and impregnated his fiancée. He would never forgive you if he were aware of this fact." Berengar held his cheek, which had reddened upon impact. He felt humiliated by the strike but could contain his rising anger. After all, he would never harm his own mother. After calming himself down, he exhaled deeply before revealing the truth of Lambert's schemes to his doting mother. "It is a punishment well deserved for the crimes of my seemingly pious little brother." Gisela looked at Berengar strangely. By the tone of his voice, Lambert had done something unforgivable to him, but she would never imagine that the two brothers were so estranged that they were plotting against one another's lives. "What did he do to you that would require such an extreme act of vengeance?" Berengar took a few moments to organize his thoughts as he paced about the room, trying to figure out the best way to inform his mother of his own brother's outright treasonous actions. After a while, he stopped in the middle of the room and stared at his mother with a somber gaze. "He tried to kill me. On 3 separate occasions that I know of, 2 of which he came incredibly close to succeeding." Gisela was shocked by the news and faltered as she fell to her knees while holding her painful heart. Berengar saw her do so and quickly rushed over to support the woman. There were several minutes of silence between the two as the loving mother thought things through in her head. With this news, many things that were confusing in the past began to make sense. Ultimately, she would not just believe Berengar's words and finally broke the silence when she had managed to recover her resolve. "Can you prove this?" Berengar nodded his head with a serious expression on his face. His mother knew that the boy was not lying by the look in his eyes. However, she would not believe it until she saw the proof herself. As such, she demanded to see it at once. "Show me the evidence." Thus Berengar opened the door and led his mother to his room, where he took out the ledger, the letter, and a written and signed testimony from Esser Ingbert. Berengar had gone through great lengths to hide and secure these items. As such, it took him a while before he could get them into his mother's hands. These 3 items contained key authentication about all 3 attempts Lambert had made on Berengar's life. When his mother read through all of the evidence Berengar had compiled against his brother, she sat down upon his bed in silence for many minutes. What Berengar had said was true, and the evidence he held in his hands was enough to convict Lambert on the charges of attempted fratricide and treason. It took some time for the woman to come back to her senses before she asked Berengar the most important question on her mind. "Why have you not brought this to your father's attention?" Berengar's expression softened as he looked upon his mother with a great degree of pity and empathy. He could not imagine the pain and suffering she was going through, knowing that her second son had attempted to kill his elder brother not just once or twice, but 3 times that could be proven. As such, Berengar got down on one knee and held his mother's trembling hand with his own while gazing into her soft, tear-filled eyes, and voiced his innermost thoughts about the dire question his loving mother had asked. No father should have to execute his own child. Chapter 53. Bring the boy to me. Gisela immediately felt her heart shatter as she heard Berengar's dire words. She immediately knew what the young man intended to do and was beside herself with the information. Berengar intended to endure Lambert's attempts on his life until he came to power so that he may spare his father the guilt of sentencing his own son to death for the crimes he had committed. She knew Lambert was guilty of heinous crimes, but she could not bear to see him executed as a common criminal. As such, she pleaded with Berengar to spare his brother's life. "Berengar, please, he's your brother." Berengar shook his head as he rejected his wounded mother's pleas of mercy. "If I allow him to live, he will only make more attempts on my life. He has powerful allies, and they will continue in their efforts to put him on the seat of power in Kufstein. As long as he lives, I am not safe in this world." Luckily for Lambert, his mother was quite insistent and had quickly grabbed a hold of her senses and came up with an alternative option that would allow Lambert to continue living while giving up his claims to the land and thus preventing his allies from conspiring against Berengar. She stared at Berengar with a level of determination that Berengar had never seen from the woman before. "We will show this information your father, and he will force Lambert to take up the vows of the Teutonic Order. He will spend the rest of his life in a righteous crusade redeeming himself." Berengar wanted to reject this notion, as he knew this could potentially allow Lambert to return to Kufstein with an army of hardened warriors at his back. However, when he saw the desperate look in his mother's eyes, he could not help but give in. After all, he still had a great degree of guilt he held from dying in his previous life without gifting his parents with any grandchildren. He could not imagine the grief they had suffered from their only child's death. He did not want his parents in this life to suffer the same way. Eventually, he sighed heavily and hugged his mother tightly. "Fine, we will do it your way." The light of hope returned to Gisela's eyes as she accepted her son's loving squeeze. After a few moments, Berengar let go of his doting mother and picked up the evidence. He would not wait any longer. Now that he had changed his plans, the quicker Lambert was expelled from the family, the safer he was. As such, he gathered his witnesses, including Lind. Though it took a few hours for Arnulf and Ingbert to arrive at the castle in Kufstein. As such, Berengar spent the time with his mother, trying to ease her anxiety. After the men had arrived, he marched into his father's study with his witnesses and evidence in hand and slammed them down upon the Baron's table, who was busy going over various reports. The old Baron looked up at his son with a confused expression and asked, "What is this?" Berengar did not beat around the bush. He quickly and efficiently explained his case against Lambert while his father looked over the materials. "Over the past few months, I have been compiling evidence against Lambert and his treasonous activities. On 3 separate occasions, he had made attempts on my life, 2 of which nearly succeeded. He has been aided by the Count of Tyrol and other nobles within this domain. Ingbert was once one of his allies and can bear witness to such deeds. Lind, the eldest daughter of Count Lothar, can also bear witness to her father's schemes with Lambert to eliminate me, establish Lambert as the future Baron, and concede our family's vast resources to the Count of Tyrol. As for the death of the late Marshal, Arnulf here has suspicions that his father found out about Lambert's misdeeds and was permanently silenced by him and his allies. Sigurd was in shock when he saw such information, but the evidence did not lie. Eventually, after processing this information for several minutes, Sigurd came to the conclusion that Lambert was guilty. Even his own fiancée had turned against him and her father. The only problem is that he could not understand why. As such, he had to clarify with the young woman why she would betray her own family for Berengar's sake. The old Baron glared at Lind furiously as he suspected her of scheming against him and his family. There was a large possibility that this was all the plan of Lothar, or so he thought until he asked her for the reasons behind her actions and heard her reply. "What do you stand to gain from betraying your father and fiancé?" The young woman instantly blushed as Berengar's father cornered her. She gazed at Berengar for confirmation that she was allowed to speak before exhaling deeply and revealing the contents of her heart. "I gain the security of my lover and the father of my child. Your son and heir Berengar." Sigurd seemed to be the only one shocked by this news, as everyone else within the room was already aware of her relationship with Berengar and the true nature of her child's parentage. This instantly made the old Baron furious as he began to yell at Lind with all his fury. "You slept with both of my sons." Lind quickly defended herself as she shook her head and explained her situation. "No, I have only ever been with Berengar. The night of his engagement ceremony, he instructed me to frame Lambert as the father to avoid suspicions. I was already pregnant at that point." I merely doused some goat blood on Lambert's bedding and laid down next to him. When he awoke from his drunken stupor, I told him that we had slept together, but nothing occurred between the two of us. I swear on my life. Sieghard felt himself getting a headache as he heard all of this information. His two sons were scheming against one another behind his back all of this time. One had attempted to murder his older brother and usurp the inheritance, and the other had cuckolded his younger brother and impregnated his fiancée. At least, as far as Sieghard was concerned, Berengar's actions were far more forgivable considering what the boy had suffered at the hands of Lambert. Eventually, he looked at his loving wife for an explanation on how to deal with this awkward situation that had been forced upon him. What do I do with all of this information? Gisela spoke to her husband with a grave tone as she commanded him on how to deal with their errant children. Order Lambert to relinquish his claims to this land and to take up the vows of the Teutonic Order where he may redeem himself in the eyes of men and God through righteous crusade. As for Berengar's actions, conceal it. After much deliberation, Sieghard sighed deeply as he gave his decree. Bring the boy to me. Chapter 54. You are no son of mine. Lambert was in his room while reading a letter from the Bishop of Innsbruck about his request for the Inquisition's interference, which the Vatican accepted. Within 2 weeks, the Inquisition would arrive and help him deal a devastating blow to his accursed elder brother. A wicked smile appeared across the boy's face as he read the letter. He had finally obtained the victory he desired, or so he thought. Just as he was about to light the evidence in his hands aflame with a candle, the door to his bedroom burst open, and the castle's guards pointed their muskets in the direction in which he sat with their bayonets affixed. Immediately Lambert reacted by trying to finish the job of destroying the evidence. He had no idea why they had barged into his room, but clearly, he was in deep trouble and could not afford for such damning information to existing. When the guards saw his action of potentially destroying evidence, they quickly apprehended the boy before he could succeed, thus obtaining the letter as further evidence of his crimes and the depth of the conspiracy against the von Kufstein family. Lambert struggled out of the grasp of the burly soldiers, but it was no use. There were too many of them pinning him down and placing chains around his limbs. As such, he cursed them as his face grew red with fury. What are you bastards doing? Have you forgotten the family in which you serve? I will have your heads for this. Instead, he was roughly dragged up to his feet and was placed before the captain of the guard, who backhanded Lambert violently for his vile tongue. The Baron has ordered us to carry out your arrest under the suspicion of assassination, attempted fratricide, and treason against the realm. Lambert's heart sank into an endless abyss as he heard those words. He realized at that moment Berengar had been one step ahead of him. For his father to order the boy's arrest, Berengar must have presented substantial evidence, though he had no idea how that scoundrel had managed to acquire it. Lambert merely lashed out verbally at the guards when he was viciously escorted to the Great Hall, where Sieghard, Berengar, and the others were waiting for his arrival. You fucking bastards, when I come to power, I will have you and your families brutally tortured to death for such treasonous activity. The boy could not accept such an outcome had occurred to him while he was merely 2 weeks away from the arrival of the Inquisition and their investigation into Berengar's heresy. He was so close to winning this war, but instead, he was brought down on the edge of victory. Lambert nearly had a heart attack when he witnessed not only Sir Ingbert but Arnulf and his fiancée Lind standing by Berengar's side acting as his witnesses. He could not believe that so many of his allies had turned against him, especially that bitch Lind. She truly was having carnal relations with his brother behind his back. However, he put on a facade and acted as if he was ignorant of the charges he was facing. After the guards forced him to kneel in front of his father, the Baron, who stared at him with a look of disgust, the boy desperately attempted to explain his way out of the precarious situation he found himself in. Father, what is the meaning of this? Sieghard glared at his second son. The boy was still putting on an act even after all of the evidence that had been accumulated. The captain of the guard approached Sieghard and handed him the letter they had confiscated from Lambert. My lord, your son Lambert was in the middle of attempting to destroy evidence of his crimes. If you read the letter, it very clearly states yet another attempt on Berengar's life by falsifying crimes of heresy and blasphemy and requesting the Inquisition's interference. Lambert was immediately frightened when he realized that the guards had caught him red-handed and began to swell up in tears as his father screamed at him with a degree of rage the boy had never witnessed before. You would bring the might of the Inquisition down upon my house? My son? Your brother. For what? Because you desire my position, which is your brother's by birthright. Do you have any remorse for your deeds whatsoever? By now Lambert was putting on a convincing display of crocodile tears which he choked back as he tried to plead with his father about his innocence. I am being framed. It is Berengar who is the wicked one. He stole my fiancée and now plots to have me removed so he can keep her to himself. Sigurd nearly snorted at the boy's response. Could the boy seriously not come up with a better excuse than that? On the other hand, Adela was present to witness the scene and was shocked by the whole development. She had no idea the two brothers' schemes were this ruthless, and the accusation of Berengar stealing Lind was particularly worrisome for her. Lind, who noticed the young girl's presence, denied this accusation. Though she desperately wanted to shove her affair with Berengar in Lambert's face, the family had already decided to conceal the truth, and thus she could not reveal it in public. Either way, Lambert would be removed from this day forth, and she would no longer have to marry the little blackguard. Instead, she denied the accusations with a convincing display as she too conjured tears to make it appear as if she was heartbroken by her fiancé's words. You bastard, I gave you my chastity, and you accuse me of having an affair with your brother. What kind of woman do you think I am? When Adela heard those words, she sighed in relief. Surely Berengar would not do such a horrible thing. Lambert, on the other hand, was on the edge of having an aneurysm from the degree of fury in which had built up inside of him. He struggled desperately in his chains to break free of the guard's grasp and attack the woman. However, the moment he lunged at her, he was brought down by the guardsman and pinned to the ground in front of the woman he once thought he loved. Staring at her with a murderous gaze, he spat out a curse upon her. You fucking whore, you not only have an affair with my brother, but you also turn me into my family, and you still have the gall to deny it. I hope there is a special place in hell for you and your bastard child. Suddenly a loud noise echoed throughout the hall. It was the sound of Sigurd furiously pounding his fist on the armrest of his seat of power before declaring his verdict. Enough, Lambert. After seeing the evidence for myself, I, Baron Sigurd von Kufstein, find you guilty of all charges and convict you of assassination, attempted fratricide, and treason. I hereby disown you from my family and order you to take the vows of the Teutonic Order. Perhaps you can redeem yourself in the eyes of God by spending the rest of your life in a righteous crusade. Guards, have this wicked child taken away to the Teutonic state. With that decree, the guards grabbed a hold of Lambert and dragged him away, kicking and screaming. The last words spoken by the boy before he was forced out of the great hall were a plea for mercy. Father, please don't do this. Unfortunately for the boy, Sigurd was too disgusted with his actions and replied mercilessly to this request. You are no son of mine. Chapter 55, A Solemn Vow. After the castle guards had dragged away Lambert, he was placed in a prison wagon and shortly thereafter hauled off to the Teutonic Order, where he would spend the rest of his days redeeming himself in the eyes of the Lord and men. The boy had committed heinous deeds and was not only forced to join the Teutonic Order but was thoroughly disowned. This result was mercy considering the plans Berengar had for the treacherous scoundrel. Yet to Lambert, it was a cruel punishment he felt he was undeserving of. As he sat in the back of the wagon looking through the iron bars which caged him, he made a solemn vow to himself and the Lord. I swear to God that one day I will rise through the ranks of the Teutonic Order and one day return to this land with an army at my back. I will not rest until those who have betrayed me have paid the price with their blood. Those were the last words Lambert spoke within the confines of his family's lands, shortly after the carriage faded into the distance and continued on its journey to the Teutonic state in the east. As for the family, they dealt with the aftermath in different ways. Henrietta grieved for the loss of her brother and refused to leave her room for weeks on end. She spent her time crying under her covers and managed to survive by having her servants look after her. She could not accept that Lambert had committed such crimes and blamed Lind for her brother's fate. Gisela spent this time mostly in the church praying for the Lord's forgiveness of her son's misdeeds. To deal with her grief, she had turned to religion, as so many do in times of desperation. The loving mother had always doted on her two sons and could not understand why things had turned out the way they had. In his suffering, Sigurd had turned to the bottle as a way to comfort himself for the mistakes he made as a father. With the rise of distilled spirits coming from Berengar's distillery, it was far easier to spend the day drinking your sorrows away. He truly blamed himself for the way things had turned out. As such, He left the governance of the barony almost entirely in Berengar's hands. After all, the boy was a far more capable leader than he could ever be. Though he had not abdicated his position, at this point, the aging man was Baron in name only. On the other hand, Lind wrote about the news to her father, informing him that Berengar had won the war of intrigue and there was no longer a point to conspire against him. She came clean to her father about her illicit relationship with the man he had plotted against and demanded that she stay in Kufstein to act as his mistress. After all, what kind of man would want to marry her now that she was pregnant with someone else's child? The Count was furious, but there was nothing he could do at this point. Ultimately, Lind convinced her father to agree to these terms by playing to his greed. If she maintained her affair with Berengar, then the profitable relationship between the two houses could continue as it always had, and potentially increase. Though Berengar would never forgive his enemies for plotting against him, now was not the time for vengeance. As such, he consolidated his forces and the newfound security he found himself in. He spent the following days improving his militia, implementing agricultural technology, and always expanding his businesses, which had begun to become extremely profitable. With Count Lothar and his allies no longer conspiring against Berengar, he was able to open up the trade of excess materials and products to the men who were once his enemies. Regardless of whether or not their troops were equipped with fine steel armor and weapons, it did not matter to Berengar as such equipment was useless against the power of the musket. Besides, they lacked the means of production and the knowledge to mass-produce plate armor. As such, at most, his enemy's forces would be mass-equipped with brigandine and mail. While effective against swords, arrows, bolts, and lances, it would be useless against a musket ball at a proper distance. Berengar's greatest advantage was the technological advancement of his forces, which increased by the day. He estimated that within a year, he would have the ability to rebore all of his troops' muskets so that they were rifled and thus far more effective. By then, he would have the capacity to engage the enemy at roughly 300 yards, potentially more considering the barrels on his muskets were 6 inches longer than the Springfield 1861 rifled musket in which he had derived the estimated effective range from. Adela had become suspicious of Berengar's potential relationship with Lind, but she had not investigated it. Instead, she spent her remaining days peacefully with Berengar, trusting that he was not a womanizer like she thought he might be. Soon she would have to return to her family's lands. After all, she did not have an excuse to stay here for so long after the engagement ceremony, and her father was pressuring for her to return. Unlike Lind, who had her father wrapped around her finger, Adela held no authority in that regard, and once she returned, it would be quite some time before she could see the man she loved again. Currently, Berengar sat next to Adela in his father's study, which he had claimed to be his own during these past few days, and where he spent most of his waking hours. The girl was accompanying him once more while chatting about the future while snacking on cookies and milk. "It's hard to believe it will be 4 years before we are married. Will you visit me for my birthday?" Berengar, who was neck-deep in paperwork, overlooked her question and merely nodded as he grunted the phrase, "Yuha," which instantly got on the little girl's nerves. She was acting so adorable and discussing their future as a couple, and all he could think of was paperwork. Thus she decided to test him to see if he was really listening. Now that Lambert is gone, Lind has no father for her child. Would you be willing to take that role? Berengar continued writing and merely replied as if he were on autopilot, completely unaware of what he had just been asked. Sure, why not? At this point, Adela began to pout. Clearly, Berengar was not paying attention to what she was saying. Either that or he was serious about her question, which only provoked her further. As such, the adolescent girl flicked his ear, which managed to gain the young man's attention. "Adela, what the hell?" When Berengar noticed the look on his face, he realized he had been caught and felt it was better to apologize for ignoring her than to continue to act like he was listening. "I am sorry, truly I am, but I am currently swamped with paperwork." "What was it you were saying?" Adela merely snorted and walked out of the office while throwing a temper tantrum. "Forget it, clearly, you're too busy to listen to what I have to say." Berengar felt embarrassed as she strutted out of his room but had too much work to do. As such, he got back to his paperwork. Hopefully, he could finish it by dinner time. At this point, his greatest concern was the arrival of the Inquisition, who would be within Kufstein in a matter of days. If he could not settle things peacefully with the Kruch's emissaries, there was only one solution. War. Chapter 56 An Entertaining Lecture. Berengar was currently in a makeshift classroom temporarily located in the local tavern of the town square. He was currently writing the alphabet down on a blackboard he had created with a piece of chalk. As he went over the sound every letter made and how to read and write them, he gazed upon his class of laborers who had gathered to begin the process of basic education. With the 40-hour workweek in session, there was a healthy amount of spare time for many of the laborers of his factories. Because of this, Berengar had offered free drinks and meals to whoever was willing to come and learn from him and his staff for a couple of hours each day after work. It had caught on pretty quickly as people could drink light beer, enjoy a nice meal, and educate themselves with brief breaks for socializing in between. Workers, supervisors, and foremen all gathered in the town square as if it were a festive occasion. Berengar had always found that an entertaining approach to education was far easier to learn from than a boring monotone instructor who sucked all the life out of the information. As such, he made games of learning and gave small prizes like an extra drink or dish to whoever could win his contests. It seemed to be working as the common people were quickly catching on to elementary level language, mathematics, and science. This was a temporary solution, of course. He intended to build genuine halls of education, and one day even universities. For now, while those things were being constructed and organized, Berengar, Lind, and Adela were teaching the common population rudimentary knowledge in their spare time. No matter how busy they were, Adela would teach the children from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., Lind would teach the women from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m., and Berengar would teach the men from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Berengar was still on the quest to find educated people who had the ability to teach others, but that was a difficult task considering the educated population was primarily from either the nobility or the priesthood, neither of which were exactly fond of the idea of teaching commoners how to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. Let alone learn the concept of science in which Berengar had begun teaching, which was basically outright heresy in the eyes of the church. Berengar was currently teaching a basic sentence on the blackboard and see which of the men in his class could read it. He scribbled down the German characters for the phrase, "A fair day's wage for a fair day's work." This was one of the many concepts he was trying to instill in the working man and nobility alike. He truly believed people should be paid the worth of their labor. After writing down the sentence, he looked upon the crowd and gave them another contest. Whoever can raise their hand first and read the sentence correctly will get another pint. The men all quickly got to work looking over their alphabet sheets and deciphering the sentence. Eventually, a thin young man covered in soot from the furnaces raised his hand before anyone else, and once called upon, answered the question correctly. Berengar called out to one of the women working in the tavern, "Bar wench, get this man a pint of beer." Soon enough, an attractive young girl came over and poured the man a pint of beer in which he was happy to accept and quickly drank from the mug. Afterward, Berengar asked a question to the class to see if they understood what the phrase meant. Now, this sentence is fairly important to every one of you. I believe that a man should be paid an appropriate amount to the worth his labor. Berengar began to stride around the tavern, picked up a liter of beer, and began to drink from it as he continued his lecture of economic philosophy during a rudimentary language lesson. As men under my employment, you are afforded payment for your labor. I also believe that the harder a man works, and the better results he gets, the more he should be paid. After saying so, he pointed at a man in the crowd and asked him a question in front of everyone. "You, sir, what is your name, and many hours a week do you work if you don't mind me asking?" The man looked around before noticing he was called upon and answered respectfully to Berengar. "I am known as Reingard, and I work 50 hours a week, my lord." Berengar then quickly pointed to another man and asked him the same question. "And you, what is your name, and how many hours do you work a week?" The man cleared his throat before speaking in an embarrassed tone. "I am Bruno, and I work 40, my lord." Berengar noticed the anxious expression on the man's face and smiled gently as he comforted the man for his choices. There is nothing wrong with working 40 hours a week. In fact, it gives you plenty of time to spend with your family or following your passions. Both are important factors to the quality of a man's work and society as a whole. After saying this, the man began to smile confidently, even after Berengar said the next piece of his impassioned speech. However, because Reingard works 10 hours a week more than you do, he is paid more than you and is more likely to be considered for a raise or a promotion in the future. We all make choices in life, We all have our own priorities. It is up to you to choose the course that would make you most happy. Each man in the room carefully contemplated Berengar's words of wisdom as if they were a creed to live by. Ultimately, Berengar concluded his lecture with a bit of humor. If you do manage to find the perfect balance in life, please let me know how you managed it, as I am dreadfully lacking in balancing my affairs at the moment. With this being said, the slightly inebriated crowd of workers began to laugh at Berengar's self-deprecating sense of humor. They could not imagine a man such as Berengar lacking a balanced life. The young man perfectly scheduled every moment of his time and was teaching them because of this. After the working men made a few good-natured jabs, Berengar began to chuckle and ended his class for the day. "Alright guys, get out of here and go back to your families. We all need to be up for work tomorrow morning, and missing sleep is detrimental to your health." After saying this, every man in the class came up to thank Berengar for the free lecture, booze, and feed. After a while, they all managed to return home, and Berengar had done the same. He still had much work to do on this night before he could get to sleep. His humorous statement was not a joke. Now that he held near absolute authority in the barony, he was swamped with work and could barely manage the time to check in on his family, who was currently grieving over Lambert's crime and sentence. Though the boy had lived, he would never return as a member of their family. Berengar did not have time to worry about such things. Tomorrow the Inquisition would arrive, and he would have to entertain the emissaries of the church. Hopefully, he could resolve this issue peacefully now that Lambert had been dealt with. Chapter 57. You will tell him that, yes? Berengar sat upon his father's seat of power as he tapped his armies thrice with his left hand and drank from a chalice of wine in his right. Standing before him was a group of priests garbed in scarlet robes with a golden cross hanging around their neck. These were the men of the Inquisition, a group of zealous and sadistic priests who rooted out, tortured, and executed heretics. The number of innocent people they had put to death was immeasurable, as they truly did not care about whether or not someone was guilty of the so-called crime of heresy, merely the thrill that came with torturing another human being. The men refused to bow to Berengar was currently acting as the Regent of Kufstein and was essentially barren in all aspects but name. Instead, they stood before Berengar, who took a sip from his golden chalice as he listened to the Inquisition as they introduced themselves. Their leader was a short fat man with an obviously balding set of grey hair and a matching mustache. If the sex crimes of the Catholic Church from Berengar's previous life were to exist in this timeline, then just by first glance, one could assume this man was engaged in such activity. Luckily for Berengar, neither Henrietta nor Adela were present, or else he would not be able to contain his wrath at the stubby fat priest's lecherous gaze. Thinking of such a possibility, Berengar instinctively sneered in disgust at the man as he introduced himself to Berengar in a way that lacked the proper respect afforded to a man of his position. The man spoke with a heavy Spanish accent, immediately telling he was not a German speaker by birth. "I am Father Alphonse, and these two are my associates, Fathers Antonio and Giles. We have come at the behest of the local priest and one Lambert von Kufstein to investigate claims of heresy. I was told that the Baron of Kufstein was a middle-aged man. Who might you be?" Berengar could not help but curse to himself inwardly. Fucking Christ, a Spaniard, a Southern Italian, and Frenchman, of course, there would not be a German in their little tribunal. It seems I won't be able to play the fellow countryman card. After having such thoughts, Berengar took a sip from his glass as he proclaimed his authority in front of the unwanted priests who had barged into his home. "I am Berengar von Kufstein, son of Sieghard von Kufstein, and acting regent of the Barony of Kufstein while my father has secluded himself in penance. All authority to deal with this matter has been invested in me by my father Baron Sieghard von Kufstein in accordance to the laws of men." Berengar made sure to emphasize that last part, as he was making it abundantly clear to the Inquisition that they had no authority here in his domain. Father Alphonse immediately frowned when he heard this news. This was the worst possible outcome. If what Berengar said was true, investigating the claims, and finding the young lord guilty may prove to be difficult. Nevertheless, Father Alphonse proceeded with his task. "Tell me, where is Lambert von Kufstein? I wish to discuss with him the concerns which he brought to our attention." Berengar glared at the Inquisition leader with a smug expression as he boldly declared Lambert's fate. Lambert has been convicted of assassination, attempted fratricide, and treason against the Barony of Kufstein. He has been disowned, stripped of his name and titles, and sent to the Teutonic Order, where he will spend the rest of his days redeeming himself in the eyes of the Lord. The fat and balding priest was stunned by this news. It had only been a matter of weeks since they had become aware of the situation, yet the man in which the Bishop of Innsbruck insisted on backing to maintain the church's power in Kufstein was already removed from the equation? How did this happen? Father Alphonse now understood why Berengar was calmly sitting on his throne sneering at him with disgust and disdain. With his key witness convicted and disgraced as a traitor and murderer, his chances of ousting this young man from power was slim. Unless he could find something in a legitimate investigation to prove he was a heretic. Now that was the church's only hope. Either that or they could just frame Berengar for the crimes he was accused of. As such, the man put on a smile and began to command Berengar as if he were a mere servant. Before his departure, Lambert had made several bold accusations of heresy within the region. As such, I will require your full cooperation in my investigation. The fat priest began to smile wickedly as he waited for Berengar's answer. All they needed to do was plant some evidence in their investigation and get the local church and its parish to side with them. The Inquisition would have enough justification to convict Berengar of heresy and remove him from power. Whoever took over this minor barony after his death was not of the church's concern so long as they abided by the whims of the Vatican. However, the response Berengar gave Father Alphonse was completely out of his expectation. Berengar took a sip from his chalice and placed it down on his armrest before shifting in his seat of power so that he was peering down at the priests below him with a gaze of intimidation. Under whose authority do you dare to investigate such accusations in my realm? All three of the priests were shocked as they stared at Berengar with contempt. Father Alphonse could no longer hold back his tongue. He had never witnessed such an impudent young lord before. As such, he began to flex his backing to Berengar, attempting to intimidate him into allowing his improper investigation. Under the authority of the Holy Father himself. As such, the priest pulled out a large scroll signed by the Pope. In it were the orders to investigate and purge Kufstein of any heretical thoughts and their believers. However, Berengar was unfazed by these remarks and merely continued to gaze down upon the men with domineering and overbearing pressure. The last time I checked, these lands were ruled over with absolute authority by the Baron of Kufstein, my father, who in his absence has appointed me regent in his stead, to act with all the authority of the Baron himself. As far as I'm concerned, neither the Pope nor the Vatican has any judicial authority in my family's lands, and you would best return from whence you came before I deem your stay no longer welcome. The words he spoke were chilling to the bone, and the other two members of the Inquisition began to tremble in Berengar's presence. Only now the priests of the Inquisition noticed the ranks of men equipped in half-plate armor and armed with what appeared to be a weird mixture of a hand cannon and spear staring at them with indifferent gazes. Berengar had called the most loyal and elite of his men here, the Grenadier, especially for this meeting. Men who had already fought and killed for Berengar at the Battle of Mining Town. Men who would willingly lay down their lives for their lord and commander who had brought them and their families up from servitude and into the well-paying jobs of industry. Outraged by the outright blasphemy in which Berengar spoke, or at least as far as he was concerned, Father Alfonso no longer acted politely to Berengar and blatantly threatened him. Blasphemy! I am warning you, if you do not submit to our investigation, then we will deem you guilty by default, and we will return with a holy order to raze this land of heathens to the ground. This threat against not only Berengar but the land and people under his dominion was the last straw. He was no longer willing to politely negotiate. Instead, he stood up from his chair and stared down at the priests below as he gave his command to Eckhard, who was currently leading the unit of Grenadier which acted as Berengar's personal guard at this moment. Vice Commander Eckhard, arrest these men for conspiracy to usurp the Barony of Kufstein. There was no hesitation in Eckhard's voice as he motioned for his men to follow the regent's orders. Yes, my lord, I will do as you command. Quickly, the Grenadier surrounded the priests and lowered their bayonets to aim at the Inquisitors' chests. Father Giles began to protest immediately as the bayonets were mere inches away from piercing his heart. I am an emissary of the Holy Father, you cannot do this. Berengar began to step down the stone steps in front of his throne and approach the three men in front of him. Father Alphonse, Father Giles, by the power invested in me as Regent of Kufstein, afforded to me by my father, Baron Siegfried von Kufstein, I hereby convict you of espionage, sabotage, and usurpation. Henceforth you shall be sentenced to death by firing squad. Men, take these would-be usurpers out into the courtyard, line them against a wall and shoot them." Immediately his troops responded in unison without a hint of disobedience in their collective voices. "Yes, my lord." Afterward, the priests of the Inquisition were dragged out of the great hall and brought into the courtyard, where the men lined up into a proper firing squad. Berengar dragged Father Antonio over to the window to watch from above as his comrades were executed. The terrified priest begged Berengar to rethink his actions and spare the Inquisitors' lives. "Lord Berengar, if you do this, you will be excommunicated and branded a heretic. The Church will consider you an enemy for eternity." Berengar merely looked over at Father Antonio with a look of indifference and raised his hand, signaling the troops to fire their shots. The thunder of gunfire and the smell of smoke filled the air as the priests' bodies were shredded apart by a dozen musket balls, their blood splattering the stone walls of the castle courtyard like a painting of death. Antonio looked in horror as his brothers were gunned down by the mighty hand cannons. He was only awoken from his shock when the iron grip of Berengar grabbed a hold of his shoulder. The young and princely man stared into the eyes of the priest with the ice-cold gaze of a born killer and responded to his earlier words. "When you return to the Vatican, inform the Holy Father that he may have the power to excommunicate me and to brand me a heretic, but ultimately when I finally perish from this world it is under the judgment of God, not the Pope, that will determine whether or not I enter the kingdom of heaven. You will tell him that, yes?" Antonio began to tremble in fear as if he had been touched by the cold hands of death and stared into the eyes of the Grim Reaper himself. After struggling to find his voice, he eventually said nothing and merely nodded at Berengar's request. From this day forth, Berengar had made a powerful enemy, one who would never forgive him for his actions here on this day. The divide would only grow further as Berengar refused to bend the knee to a corrupt and bloated church, and the supreme pontiff who presided over it. Chapter 58: A Stern Warning. With the death of the Inquisition, a gloomy atmosphere had fallen over the castle of Kufstein. His family was not immediately aware of the fact that Berengar had just slapped the church in its face and denied its authority in his family's lands. Adela was the first to find out about such a thing. Having heard the gunshots from outside, she rushed to the great hall, where she checked to see if Berengar was uninjured. When she arrived, she witnessed the scene of Berengar grasping onto Father Antonio's shoulder and staring at the priest with a cold and murderous gaze. Adela was unaccustomed with the ruthless expression on Berengar's face, for she had never before witnessed his wrath. This was not the gentle smile and loving eyes he showed to his loved ones. Rather, it was the callous gaze of a vengeful tyrant who took pleasure in punishing his enemies. She had never seen such a side of Berengar before, and as a deeply devout Catholic, Adela was concerned that Berengar had done something unforgivable. However, she never would have guessed that Berengar had executed 2 priests in his courtyard. When she looked out the window to see what had transpired, she was horrified by the bloody mess that remained from the scene of the Inquisitor's execution. She could not contain her terror and shrieked as she gazed upon the merciless display of Berengar's authority. When Berengar heard the screams of his fiancée, he looked over to her in shock, and wondered why was Adela there at this particular moment. This was not something he intended for the young girl to witness. In her dismay, Adela quickly ran over to Berengar and Father Antonio and inquired why such a horrific scene occurred. "Berengar, what have you done?" Berengar was well aware of Adela's extremely religious nature and had never actually talked to her about his views on the subject. After all, he was afraid she would react poorly to his thoughts about the church. However, he could not lie his way out of this one. He had just executed 2 emissaries of the Vatican in his own courtyard. As such, he put on a stern expression and scolded the little girl for recklessly making assumptions. "The church conspired against me and aided my brother in his attempts to usurp my birthright. These men came here as part of my brother's final ploy to have me convicted as a heretic and executed. They even threatened to raze my family's lands to the ground when I refused to recognize the legitimacy of their so-called investigation. As such, I had them executed. Isn't that right, Father Antonio?" Berengar gave the Inquisitor an oppressive gaze, implying that if the priest did not admit to his crimes, Berengar would have him suffer the same fate as the shredded corpses in the courtyard below. The truth was, despite being an excellent torturer, Antonio was a cowardly man who deeply feared death. As such, the Inquisitor quickly crumbled and admitted to Adela the crimes of the church. What Berengar says is correct. Lambert, while sponsored by your local priest, petitioned the Bishop of Innsbruck to request an investigation from the Inquisition into accusations about Berengar's heretical views. We knew the charges were false but were afraid that Berengar would not follow the will of the Church. Thus, we planned to frame and convict him anyway, which we would have done if he had allowed us to investigate the charges against him. Adela was shocked to hear this news. All her life, she looked up to the Church as a beacon of hope and viewed them as the arbiters of truth. Yet these men had conspired against Berengar to install a puppet onto the seat of power in Kufstein. It was as if the image she had in her mind about a flawless church came crumbling down around her as she listened to the wicked priest confess to the crimes he had committed. She could tell the man was speaking the truth, even if it was under duress. Berengar noticed the stunned expression on the girl's face and could tell that she was in the middle of an existential crisis, and as such, he walked over to his little fiancée and hugged her while patting her head and whispered his utopian propaganda into her fine ears. My sweet Adela, I know you are faithful, and I respect that, but men rule the Church, and no man is above corruption. As long as you have faith in Christ and follow his teachings, you will be a good Christian woman. Father Antonio could not help but mutter the word, blasphemy, under his breath. However, the moment he did so, Berengar stared fiercely at him, and the man instantly shut his trap. After hearing Berengar's words, Adela wanted to know more of his view of Christianity. However, she realized that he was currently dreadfully busy and decided to contemplate his words while praying to the Lord about which path to follow. After thinking it over for a few moments, she looked up at Berengar with her shining sapphire eyes and thanked him for his comfort. Thank you, Berengar. I do not know what I would do without you. Afterward, the girl released herself from his embrace and returned to her room. She had many things to think about and prepare for. She knew Berengar's actions would invoke the ire of the Church, and as such, she wanted to protect him to the best of her abilities. Thus she began to write a letter to her father, who was currently in his castle in Graz, and inform him about the recent events within Kufstein. She would remind him to honor the terms of their alliance with the von Kufstein family if such actions were needed. Berengar remained with Father Antonio and continued to exude his authority while in the priest's presence. If I see you or any other members of your wicked order entering the confines of my family's lands, I will have you and your ilk shot on sight. Is that understood? Father Antonio had nearly soiled himself in fear at this point. He had witnessed the power of the muskets as their volley fire mangled the bodies of his fellow members of the Inquisition. He had no intentions of ever returning to this godless land and would make sure to warn the other members of his order to avoid Kufstein at all costs. With his departure, Berengar had seized absolute authority over this barony comprised of roughly 20,000 people and now reigned supreme. Chapter 59 Render unto Caesar. After Father Antonio's departure, word quickly spread around Kufstein of the Church's actions and plots to usurp the barony and install a puppet on the seat of power. Mostly thanks to Berengar's intricate spy network, Gisela, who had turned to God during her recent crisis, immediately confronted Berengar about his rash actions. She could not believe that he would so cruelly execute ordained priests of the Church. As such, she scolded her eldest son as if he were a small child caught with his hands in the cookie jar. How could you do such a thing? Do you not fear the wrath of God? Berengar merely laughed at her comments with a smug grin on his face. If God truly cared about what mankind is on this great earth, he would not allow his so-called church to be ruled by murderers, rapists, and thieves. The way Berengar spoke about God was indeed blasphemous from the eyes of a God-fearing woman like herself. Gisela could not believe Berengar viewed the church in such a manner. She further emphasized the seriousness of the situation to her eldest son. You will be excommunicated for this, maybe even damned as a heretic. Berengar looked at his mother with a look of pity as he began making her question her beliefs like the serpent he was. Mother, have you ever actually read the Bible? Gisela looked at her son like he was an idiot before proclaiming. Of course not. It is up to the clergy to decipher God's word. You should know this, Berengar. Berengar merely shook his head as he pulled a large leather-bound book out of his desk and placed it on the table. It was an accurately translated Bible in the German language. He pushed the Bible in the direction of his mother, encouraging her to take a look for herself. Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Matthew chapter 22 verse 21. Gisela looked at Berengar with a confused expression, but his meaning could not be clearer. He flipped to the page which contained the verse he had quoted, showing his mother the full context. Afterward, he pointed at himself and explained the verse with an indifferent expression on his immaculate face. I am the Caesar of this land. According to the words of Christ, I hold all authority in this earthly domain we call the Barony of Kufstein. The church should focus their efforts on spirituality and leave the politics of this world to the men of this world. Gisela could hardly believe her ears as she heard Berengar quote scripture and use it in a way to legitimize his ideas of the separation of church and state. Berengar's views were extremely contradictory to the common belief of the Catholic Church, which maintained a large degree of political control over the European kingdoms. Nevertheless, the words he spoke were true, and Gisela had no response to them. Seeing that his mother was conflicted, Berengar stood up from his desk and approached his mother, and wrapped his arms around her, showing her the same degree of comfort he showed Adela not too long ago. Mother, I know you're worried about me and my safety. I also know you are deeply concerned about my soul after what happened with Lambert. However, I promise you all I am doing is in the best interests of our family and the people of Kufstein. Gisela accepted her son's loving embrace, and as she looked into his warm expression, her worries about him following the path of Satan began to vanish. He was still the gentle and kind boy she had doted on all of these years. Though his actions may seem extreme, he did them with the safety and security of his family and the people in his mind. Berengar knew that his mother was shaken up by Lambert's true nature and was suspecting him to be equally as despicable deep down inside, and as such, he had to play the part of the loving son. Unlike Lambert, Berengar deeply cared for his family in both his past life and his current one. He spared Lambert because he could not imagine the suffering his family would go through if he had executed the little scoundrel. If Lambert had never conspired against Berengar, then he never would have stolen his fiancée and forced him out of the family. However, what Gisela did not know is that Berengar truly did have a wicked and ruthless nature. However, he reserved it entirely for his enemies, and at this point, the Catholic Church had become his enemy. By conspiring against him, Berengar viewed them as a threat to his existence and would not rest until their stranglehold over the German people and the lands they inhabited was fully liberated. He was willing to do great evil to achieve these goals. If one could describe Berengar's personality, it was practically split in two. He was loving, kind, gentle, and caring for his loved ones. Yet, he was brutal, ruthless, sadistic, and cruel to his enemies. The reason why the people who loved him were so worried about his recent actions was that it was entirely out of the character he had always shown them. However, after hearing Berengar's explanation, Gisela chose to believe in his actions and supported him in his endeavors. After all, the rest of the family was currently still processing their grief about Lambert's removal. Both Henrietta and Sigurd had shut themselves in their rooms, hiding from the world at large. Right now, the only person Gisela could speak to about her feelings was her son and her priest. Though now that she knew the priest had conspired against her son, she would not be going to church anytime soon. Instead, the mature beauty grabbed a hold of the Bible Berengar had given her and decided to spend some time educating herself about the Word of God from the source directly. Gisela thanked Berengar for understanding her position and comforting her before leaving the room. Thank you, Berengar. You have always been and will always be my beloved son. With those words said, she departed the room and returned to her quarters to look after her husband, who was currently intoxicated and depressed. Berengar, on the other hand, stayed in his quarters and continued to fulfill his obligations as regent. It would be a matter of hours before he could have a break and continue to educate the common folk of Kufstein. Chapter 60 Combating Misinformation. After consulting with his mother about his previous actions, Berengar arrived at Ludwig's workshop, where he greeted his old friend with a quick hug. Both men had been swamped with work recently and could immediately feel each other's growing exhaustion. Ludwig, my old friend, tell me you have some good news? Ludwig chuckled lightly as he heard Berengar's remarks. He indeed did have good news. Well, my lord, you picked the most opportune time to pick a fight with the church. After all, the printing press machines you invented have long since been implemented and are currently working at full capacity. You just have to say the word, and we will change their production output to help you fight the misinformation the church is bound to present about you. Berengar slapped Ludwig on the shoulder and gave him a thumbs up. Ludwig, you are a genius. The old man smiled at the compliment and brought Berengar into the factory, which had been constructed explicitly for paper manufacture and printing materials. Water-powered paper mills were set throughout the large factory. Once processed, they were placed on the printing presses to make the various reading materials Berengar introduced for public education. However, right now, he had a dire need to spread the word of the church's sins, and as such, he needed a lot of pamphlets. Berengar currently stood in front of all the workers who had gathered before him. By now, they were well aware of the ploys against him by the church, and as such, he did not need to explain the whole situation. Berengar took out a prototype pamphlet he had designed and sent it to the foreman of the factory. "I need these made in the thousands so that we can ship them across the German-speaking regions. It is my hope that every literate man may read of the church's misdeeds. Can this be done?" The foreman of the press was a middle-aged man with short gray hair and a mustache. He was dressed in the new Renaissance-style peasant attire Berengar had introduced to his population through his textile factories. His hair was also slicked back with pomade much like Berengar's, and his mustache was properly waxed with the material. The man had an ecstatic expression on his face. He was always excited to help the Regent of Kufstein. After all, without the young man's innovations, he would still be breaking his back tending to a farm somewhere while gaining nothing but the scraps. Now, this man was part of the growing middle class and was quite wealthy among the common population. He owed his success in life to Berengar and would never forgive the bastards in the church for trying to frame him. As such, he quickly nodded his head and gave Berengar a satisfactory answer. "Yes, of course, my lord. I promise you, by the time the church hears about what you have done to those damned inquisitors, all of Tyrol and most of Austria will be aware of those bastards' misdeeds." Berengar smiled and shook the man's hand with excitement. It was good to have capable people working for him. If this man pulled this off, he might actually have to give the whole factory a raise. However, he made sure to give the man and his crew a fair warning before doing so. "Overtime is completely voluntary. I do not want you guys working so much that you neglect your family and your health. Just know that I will be offering proper compensation if you choose to work extra hours. If not, that is entirely up to you, and I respect your choices." To Berengar, the people under his rule were part of the people he showed his more gentle side to. These were men, women, and children under his protection as sovereign, and he would not mistreat them if he could avoid it. He genuinely cared for the happiness and well-being of his people, as he too had once been a commoner in his previous life. With that said, he bade farewell to the factory workers and returned to his family's castles, where Lind quickly greeted him. By the look on her face, she had good news, and as such, Berengar dragged her to his study. He sat down on his desk and offered his pregnant lover a seat before asking her about the reason for her excited appearance. "Do you want to tell me why you are smiling from ear to ear?" "Yes." Lind was smiling fervently and could not wait to inform the father of her child of the good news she had. "I have successfully established another cell in Innsbruck and Trient. Soon enough, the entire counties of Tyrol and Trient will be under our surveillance." Berengar was delighted by the news and rushed out from his desk and kissed the heavenly beauty passionately after hearing the information she provided. It was too early in the day for the couple to fool around, but he could not help himself from doing so after he heard the good news. Eventually, he managed to contain his growing lust and instead sat next to his lover. He wanted to know more about the details of her operations. Lind carefully explained how she had contacted trustworthy people and informed them that she wanted to form a spy network, though she did not explain who it was that she was working for when regarding her contact in Trient. Over time, the cells were fully established and were operating independently as per usual. As of right now, Berengar's ability to disseminate propaganda had greatly expanded beyond his own borders. Pretty soon, the commoners of other regions would see him as an ideal candidate for leadership. By the time he began to make his move for his political aspirations, few among the common population would believe the church's lies. After spending some quality time with Lind, Berengar dismissed her before returning to the village, where he oversaw another day of instruction of basic education for the commoners in his realm. He began to wish for the day he did not have to instruct these people himself. Hopefully, he could find some competent teachers soon.